the anxieties that they have, and the obsession which they have with my constituency. And so all these cheap videos with cheap talent that they are making to try to make me look bad, Mr. Speaker, I want to save them that hassle. And I want to let them know, Mr. Speaker, and I challenge them again. I did so in the last sitting. I asked them respectfully to name one project in ancillary canneries which they have started and completed between the years 2011 and 2016. And Mr. Speaker, in the last sitting, I named 5. When we took office, Mr. Speaker, in 2016, the road from Roseau to Varna was a pothole. And it was a road, Mr. Speaker, that they patched every single year. And what we have done, Mr. Speaker, is we came in and the Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure looked at the road and they said, you know, this road, Mr. Speaker, has been neglected for decades. And this road, therefore, Mr. Speaker, requires some care and love. And what we did, Mr. Speaker, was we ripped up the entire surface of the road, redid the base, and today the people of Monda and Varna and Millet and other areas, Mr. Speaker, have a well-paved and marked road that is done by the United Workers' Party administration. But, Mr. Speaker, there was no election on the horizon in the year 2017 when we did that road. Mr. Speaker, were hundreds of residents and farmers who were inconvenienced. And because of that, Mr. Speaker, that was the motivating factor by which we decided to implement the project. Nobody is about politics. We started working, Mr. Speaker, in the beginning of the term. Mr. Speaker, the community center at Derando, a community center which, Mr. Speaker, was built by Ira Duvey when he was the rep. And that center, Mr. Speaker, between the years 1997 all the way to 2006, was neglected, Mr. Speaker. It became a home of rats and bats and cockroaches. Today, Mr. Speaker, with care and with development, we have transformed it into a human resource development center. Talk about rush projects. The Canneries playing field was started 3 months before the election. They attempted to build a center for the youth in ancillary that cannot be completed yet, Mr. Speaker. The bridge that they started, we had to finish the Canneries Bridge. They collected the dredging fee, Mr. Speaker, collect monies from the people of St. Lucia and did not dredge the John Compton Dam. And so, Mr. Speaker, what it did, it undermined the island's capacity to build resilience for its water supply. And so today, Mr. Speaker, the drought effects that we're feeling now is as a result of inheriting, Mr. Speaker, neglect from the members opposite while they were in government. So if they had fixed these problems, people of St. Lucia would have been better able to cope with the drought situation today. And you want to lecture about governance? Mr. Speaker, you know what they say about recycling? When you recycle plastic, you get plastic. When you recycle glass, you get glass. And when you recycle failures, you also get failures. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will not listen to people. I mean, if there were a group of men on this side that had no experience in government. Look, the member for Vieux-Fort South was in government since 1978. He's tired, he's a spent force, Mr. Speaker. He has no ideas. So how can you re-elect him? The member for Castries East was the Deputy Prime Minister since 1997. Mr. Speaker, acted on many occasions. The member for Castries South was, what was he, the attaché to the Prime Minister, Director of PS. They all had their tries, and they've all failed, Mr. Speaker. So why should we listen to them? Why should we listen to them? Mr. Speaker, the member for Dennery North attempted to build a playing field at Marigo. Okay? You should see the dressing room. Mr. Speaker, and who is the contractor, I ask him today, Who is the contractor? Who are the principals of the company called ADAR Inc., Mr. Speaker? Tell us about that. And why was ADAR Inc. given a contract? And what was the political connection between Castries Southeast and ADAR Inc.? I asked those questions, and maybe later today he can address them. But Mr. Speaker, what we're doing here is that we have seen a COVID situation that has landed us, Mr. Speaker, in dire straits. We're trying to recover an economy that otherwise would have depended on tourism. And so, Mr. Speaker, as the tourism revenues would have fallen out, what we need to come to this House and do is have a constructive debate. But what is disappointing about today is that I've heard nothing new, no ideas that we can perhaps take on board to help to get St. Lucia out of this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, the world is indeed facing an economic crisis it has not seen since the 1930s Great Depression. And so, Mr. Speaker, that in itself will have implications for small island developing states like St. Lucia that are susceptible to exogenous shocks. And so, Mr. Speaker, today, we don't want to discuss low political arguments. Let's raise the level of the debate. But if you want to get political, do talk about your stewardship. Do give account. Do tell us what really happened with the Jafali affair. Do tell us what went wrong. And don't leave us to speculate and to guess. We woke up one morning, Mr. Speaker, and I remember very well how that happened. I was reading the Daily Mail. And then all of a sudden, I see that we had a diplomat whose name we couldn't pronounce. And I heard the member for Castries South. He was interviewed on Timothy Polio. At the time, he was in charge of Newspin. And he told Timothy Polio then that he wasn't at liberty to discuss who approved the passport for Dr. Jafali. And I want you to stand now on a point of order, because this is your opportunity to speak on it. And if you want to speak now and clear your name, I will give you the rest of my time. I have 45 minutes left, Mr. Speaker. And I want to dedicate the rest of my time. I know if I move such a motion, my members to my left will support me. And we give him 45 minutes right now to clear the air on the Jafali affair. Tell the people of St. Lucia what really went wrong. And unless he does that, Mr. Speaker, I would advise him, Mr. Speaker, to stay quiet for the rest of the evening. But you can't be talking about everything else. But yet, Mr. Speaker, you don't want to talk about those issues that concern you. You've had 4 years to speak about it. 4 years have passed, and you have said nothing. You know, according to my favorite talk show host, not a word, not a word, not a word from the member for Castries South. And so, Mr. Speaker, we want to come here and reorganize this economy and use construction to stimulate this economy. And this is not true. The member for Dennery North, you know fully well that there is a social stabilization program. We discussed the NIC bill here, where we allowed individuals ranging from $30 to $80 million from 3 to 6 months, allowing individuals to get as much as $500 to $1,500 a month from the NIC contribution. And that is in our social stability. You know that fully well. So when you say that there are other things that we could have borrowed the money to do, implying and inferring that somehow we are neglecting the social need at this time for the thousands of workers that have lost their jobs or have been displaced as a result of tourism and other sectors. That is abusing the parliamentary privilege with which you have. So that is misleading the country, misleading the House. You know fully well that now the uninformal sector, the individuals, Mr. Speaker, who have had to lose their jobs without any NIC contribution. We went further, Mr. Speaker, to put another $20 million, make that $20 million available, Mr. Speaker, so that we can provide income support to that sector of the economy. The hairdressers, the taxi drivers, Mr. Speaker, housekeepers and those individuals who were not covered by NIC now have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to receive an economic cushion from the hard work of this government. And so that is it, Mr. Speaker. I am willing to answer any questions you want to ask.
Honorable member.
As long as you're willing to answer a few from me. And so, Mr. Speaker, and so the latest political tactic, Mr. Speaker, is tapping the telephone conversations of MPs. Tapping the political conversation of MPs. And so, Mr. Speaker, as they are so worried, Mr. Speaker, I want to move on and talk about more substantive matters. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, it was said today that COVID-19, as a member from Castries East, I'm quoting, and leader of the opposition, COVID-19 caught the government with its pants down. That's what he said. Mr. Speaker, inferring that somehow we didn't have the plans that were necessary, or we weren't ready for a pandemic such as the one that we have seen. But I want to put it to the honorable member, Mr. Speaker, that the world has been caught with its pants down. As we see what has happened in China, and we see what has happened in the United States, that have lost over 30 million jobs, Mr. Speaker, and significant economic contraction. Mr. Speaker, I put it to them that if they were the government in power that had to preside over the affairs and the response of COVID-19, they would not have been caught with their pants down, but they would have been caught, Mr. Speaker, with their pants off. You guys have no plan. If you did, these debates would have been a lot more enlightening. These debates would have been a lot more engaging. But, Mr. Speaker, they come and they repeat the same old narratives, the same old messages, and all they have done is presided over failure. And the numbers are there to show. These are not my words. The debt under you was the worst. The unemployment rate was terrible. The GDP growth was below zero. So how are you going to come now to make a valiant contribution of what happened? So, Mr. Speaker, COVID-19, let me tell you what has happened. We have done, Mr. Speaker, over 1,000 tests so far. And so, Mr. Speaker, by doing those 1,000 tests, what the situation revealed was that we've got 18 cases. 18 cases, 100% recovery rate, Mr. Speaker. And so today, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to boast that St. Lucia is among few countries in the world that have had 0 deaths, Mr. Speaker, but also at this present time, Mr. Speaker, we have 0 positive cases in COVID-19. And those are the facts. And so, Mr. Speaker, the rate of COVID incidence is very low. We haven't had a COVID case in 28 days, Mr. Speaker. And that is because we planned. Despite, and to the contrary of the suggestion that we were caught with our pants down by this pandemic, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely ridiculous. Mr. Speaker, the command center was set up. We had quarantine facilities of the highest caliber. And so far, Mr. Speaker, 5 hotels have been used, and over 1,000 St. Lucian nationals have stayed in those quarantine facilities. Mr. Speaker, we've set up respiratory clinics all over St. Lucia to do the testing, to ensure that we can do community tracing, and we can ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we reduce any opportunity for community spread. Mr. Speaker, we opened up Owen King EU Hospital, a project, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition could not accomplish. It took them 5 years in government and they still couldn't open it. And so, Mr. Speaker, they were at best succeeding to name the hospital. And so, Mr. Speaker, we were able to come and to implement it. Mr. Speaker, Victoria Hospital has been transformed into an 80-bed respiratory facility. And that's where we're treating the COVID cases, Mr. Speaker. Several beds, 80 beds, Mr. Speaker, have been provided at VH. We've had the Cuban Medical Brigade, Mr. Speaker, of over 130 that came, Mr. Speaker, to St. Lucia to help and to beef up the resilience and capacity of our health sector to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we are driving this process. We put in social stabilization programs to ensure that COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, that we fight this pandemic and win this pandemic. And so far, Mr. Speaker, our health sector has been doing a tremendous job, led by the Minister of Health, in fighting and responding to COVID-19. So, Mr. Speaker, we have looked at this fight on two fronts, the health fight and the economic fight, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we do our best to keep the people of St. Lucia safe from this global pandemic. Mr. Speaker, as we fight the economic fight, as have been stated by numerous members here today, the construction sector is seen as one of those that can fast-track a stimulus in this economy, bringing about jobs, bringing about opportunity. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of Ancillary Canaries, who will be among the biggest beneficiaries of this project, Mr. Speaker, I no doubt give my strongest support to the motion that is put forward here to borrow $7.945 million from the Caribbean Development Bank for the construction of the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Reconstruction Project. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.
Honourable members, just one quick question. Do you expect the member for Vieux-Fort North to return? The member for Vieux-Fort North, do you expect him to return? Okay then, you expect him? Member for Vieux-Fort South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've decided to add my voice to this debate, having heard several references and statements to my tenure as Minister of Finance and former Prime Minister of this country. You know, Mr. Speaker, the question was asked today by someone in the social media, why roads excite politicians? Why roads excite politicians? Why is it such a big deal for politicians? And why should it be, the argument ran, because basically politicians are doing their jobs. They're supposed to build infrastructure for the people of the country. So why do roads excite politicians and mean so much? Now, Mr. Speaker, I guess the answer is not difficult to find. For one thing, promises are made to constituents about roads and the efforts they will make to improve the quality of their domestic infrastructure. And you heard testimony from the member for Grosile earlier today. Then whether we like it or not, I guess in some instances, roads improve the quality of life. You build roads in a community, it attracts housing, it attracts buildings, and it allows people to invest, give people an opportunity to invest which previously they might not have if the roads were absent. So there's a relationship to the quality of life. And then, of course, for some politicians, Mr. Speaker, the roads matter too because jobs, contracts to be given, and there's a lot of interest in who are the beneficiaries of those contracts. But in this instance, as we have heard time and time again today, Mr. Speaker, during this debate, this contract to build or to rehabilitate the East Coast Highway will have nothing to do with our local procurement rules in the sense that direct awards can be made. Because it is CDB administered, then we have to go through the regime of bidding, selection of bidders, and the final determination. So, Mr. Speaker, roads do excite politicians, and roads do mean something for politicians. However, the problem now is one of context. That's the issue. Do we make these investments to the extent that we are doing because of the current context that we face? And while it was pleasurable for members on the other opposite side to attack the stance of some of the members of the opposition on this resolution and the one last week, it is clear that they are making a very simple point. That we are engaged in this, in a particular context, in a particular situation, and the question is whether we are paying attention to the cries, to the needs of our constituents and our people. That is the question. And so while there was understandable laughter when the point was made about horses before people, the fundamental reality today is whether we first answer to the needs of our people and rethink investments that we make to resolve their existing problems and then pick up the pieces. That's the fundamental question. Or, alternatively, the option is that yes, you do engage in some select investment in your capital program, but at the same time, you make the adjustments to take care of the burning needs of the people of the country. And Mr. Speaker, I am only repeating what has been said in the House before. What are some of these needs? Thousands have been thrown on the breadline because of the closure of hotels and the plant of the hotel sector. Then, of course, there is the specter of a salary reduction, a salary cut, howsoever disguised, whether it's deferred lending or deferred payments or whatever the case is. The reality is that a request is being made for a salary cut. Then we have the unspoken issue of the rising prices in the supermarkets. No one can understand why prices are rising at the rate that they are at Massey. Why? No one can intervene, offer an explanation, calm the fears, calm the anxieties, and a day does not pass when citizens are not the price of cheese, the price of butter, the price of beans, whatever the case may be. And the question they're asking is, well, thousands of us are out of work, we don't have an income, we only have a partial income. Why is this happening now? Are we dealing with a situation of scarcity, and therefore it's inevitable prices would increase? Then there are the anxieties about healthcare. And of course, everybody is now relieved and happy that OKEU hospital is open. And let me say this, Mr. Speaker, and this is just a passing comment. The OKEU hospital was never, ever officially opened by the former government. What the former government did was simply to have a naming ceremony for OKEU to reassure the Europeans of the intentions of the government and people of St. Lucia to pave the way for the opening of the hospital. That's all. And there was a particular representative of the European Union who felt that, and who reported to us, that there was deep disappointment in Europe about the failure to commission the hospital, and he needed to at least communicate that there is progress. That is why we took the opportunity to name the hospital and separate the formal naming of the hospital from the formal opening of the hospital. But Mr. Speaker, this is a period when we have to look after even the simple things. Because there are a lot of sensitivities, Mr. Speaker, a lot of anxieties, and we're all parliamentary representatives. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I hear the cries of the disabled people when they say it has taken 2 months and they haven't got paid. And mind you, the allocation which they reduced by this government, so really you are dealing with a heavily depleted allocation. These are little things, but in a crisis, Mr. Speaker, they matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will go on to say that I suspect the people of St. Lucia have no interest in our debate over this roads issue. You know. Whether we speak from the government side or from the opposition, I don't know if they're preoccupied with that. They're really preoccupied with the burning issues that affect their daily lives. And what is happening is they're not hearing anything from our parliament to say, look, we understand your plight and your difficulties. We're reaching out and we want to change the circumstances. That's the issue. We are in business as usual. These poor people need to know how their problems are going to be resolved. Mr. Speaker, if I may, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to be singling out Commerce, the parliamentary representative for Suzel Soldibus. He adds Soldibus proudly to it these days. I'm not going to. I mean, I leave that for another time. But let me just say this. Right now, there are hundreds of small businesses that are facing the specter of closure. Some of them will never ever resurrect in the circumstances that we are in. But you know what? When some of them call the Ministry of Commerce and say, where is the stimulus for the small business? The response, understandably, is we are preparing it. We have not come up with a proposal yet. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem is that by the time the ministry comes up with a proposal for the small businesses, by that time, a lot of them would have closed and gone out of business. We have to save that sector. We have to save the business sector. Now, this is a government, Mr. Speaker, that takes no advice from the opposition. All advice we give is stingy. Something wrong with it. You advise them on legislation, you can forget that. They're not interested in that. You advise them on priorities, you can forget that. You can advise them on social matters, forget that. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, and don't of course go and talk about tourism. You forget it. No. When? No, you, honorable member, stay out of that. Put on your mask and keep quiet.
Honorable member, you mean?
No, Mr. Speaker. Let me say this, Mr. Speaker. You have done a great job today, so I like the trend you have set, and I'll continue. But in a short while, I may have to reverse course. Now, Mr. Speaker, my point is, Mr. Speaker, that hundreds of small businesses have closed. We need to come up with a package for them. Mr. Speaker, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that what we should be doing is to consider a grant of at least $20,000 to each small business to tide them over. Now, the thing is interesting, Mr. Speaker. We are talking, Mr. Speaker, of a time frame of 3 months, as if the disaster that faces us is just 3 months. It's not 3 months. The crisis that faces us will endure well into 2021. There's no question about that. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the recent events in the United States should intensify our worry and our concern. The fact is, St. Lucia is threatened, as perhaps the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago was referring to his own country, from the uncontrollable pandemic in Brazil. We are threatened in the north by the United States and what is taking place, and we are threatened across the Atlantic by what is taking place in Europe, notwithstanding the successes that have been made. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many small businesses we have operating. I doubt it's as many as 5,000. I doubt it. But you know, a grant of $20,000, Mr. Speaker, a grant for 5,000 persons is just $10 million. And I have pleaded before that the amount that has been got from NIC be redeployed so that some assistance can reach these individuals and these persons who operate small businesses. And so, Mr. Speaker, that is the context. And as I say to you, I don't even believe. I believe so. I don't know. I mean, how much is it? Is it 100 million? I would be surprised if it is as much as 100 million. 5,000 by 20,000? But you can check it. All of you can check it out. I'm not too sure that it could be 100 million. And if by chance I'm wrong, and I'm certain that there are fewer businesses, if I'm wrong, then clearly you can adjust appropriately, because I don't think we are dealing with 5,000. All right, now, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the whole tenor of this debate in this House would have changed considerably if we were dealing with a matter like that. How do we reach out and assist our people who are crying and are in pain? And we have spent a whole day debating a resolution about a road, but not about people's needs. That's the issue. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a thing called karma. Karma. It comes to haunt all of us at some point. Or it comes to haunt all of us at some point, Mr. Speaker. When the former government was in office and faced the world economic crisis and the downturn, when they faced it, and we had to come to this House to borrow, on every occasion we were pilloried. It did not matter, Mr. Speaker, that on every occasion when that happened, I explained that we were economic and we had no choice but to borrow to revive this economy. But today, Mr. Speaker, what do you see? This government has been compelled, has been forced to borrow millions of dollars to sustain this economy and to sustain the country. Karma speaks. And then you expect us on this side suddenly to understand. But when we explain to you, you refuse to understand. There's a thing called karma. It has come to haunt you. But you know, Mr. Speaker, despite what has been said, I do not believe that this opposition in any way does not accept the government has to borrow money at this time. They have no choice. No choice, but you know this. This government comes to the House, they don't show that they're contrite. They're arrogant. The Prime Minister beats his chest, the member from Miku South. We needed $500 million to close. We have got the $500 million. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is confidence in this government. We have raised it. And this is repeated here by other members. Confidence in this government. Never mind that the specter of bonds awaits, and you have gone to the market and all your bonds can't be subscribed just yet. But you know, Mr. Speaker, that is not a way to handle these matters. Politics is about psychology as it is about anything else. Because all that the members on this side have done, Mr. Speaker, is simply to say, where are the priorities? They have misplaced priorities. Let us reconsider. Answer to the needs of people. That's all they have said. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's commonplace in this House for people, for ridicule, to be attached. The Honourable Member for Castries Southeast, of course, referred to me as I'm a spent politician. Yeah, age, you know. I'm a senior citizen now, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, entitled to special privileges. Like when I go to the bank, you know, they'll call me out and so on. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Cockalorum, the parliamentary representative from ancillary canneries, Cockalorum, you know what that is? You know what it is? You're opening your eyes. He says that I'm in politics since 1978. I'm a spent force, tired failure. And if you don't know what Cockalorum means, it simply means a self-important little man. A small man of himself, and no one can deny that the honourable member has a big opinion. I know, Mr. Speaker, the sound, that's okay. That's okay, I have a big belly.
Honourable member.
Woe be unto you when you reach my age and you have a big belly, you look very unusual.
Honourable.
Woe be unto you.
Honourable.
Now, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I told you I'll take a little detour, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, honourable members. I think we've had our share of humour for the day across the table.
So, Mr. Speaker, the sound of the word may have initially caught your eye. But you know, no. And not even you on my side. What am I going to do? Now, Mr. Speaker, let me say this, Mr. Speaker. I know if the Prime Minister, the member for Miku South, the Minister of Finance, can come to this House and say how successful they have been in raising money, and there's a lot of all this confidence. Look at what the World Bank is doing, look at what the IMF is doing, look at what this one is doing, look at what that one is doing, look at what the CDB is doing. How do you expect civil servants hearing this to accept their salaries should be cut? How? On what grounds? And you know, Mr. Speaker, I have seen some things in all of this I find grossly distasteful. I have seen a letter written by the government to credit unions, asking the credit unions to invest in the government bonds for the payment of salaries. I don't want to touch the savings of ordinary people, Mr. Speaker. Why? Why are we interfering with the savings of ordinary people? This should never be happening, Mr. Speaker. I want to turn very briefly on the rehabilitation of the highway. Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody has any doubt that the Millennium Highway needs urgent rehabilitation. Very urgent. It's clear that the structure of that road has gone. In fact, anybody who's familiar with the road would notice that when the road was newly opened, the level, the height of the road has simply moved downwards, and it's now much flatter in the Castries Basin. And inevitably, with all these earth movements, you're going to be in trouble. And that's at the cul-de-sac end, yes. And again, I repeat, I don't think anybody on this side of the House felt that that road should not be repaired. I think there's no question that the road is bad. Of course, the question is how did the government exercise choices and whether they have exercised the best choice in all the circumstances. And Honorable Member for Castries East, Honorable Member for Castries East adverted to the OFID loan that had been given. On much the same terms as the CDB loan, the difference was that at the end of the intersection between the Millennium Highway and the main cul-de-sac road, a major roundabout would have been constructed in that area. Land was acquired so as to begin to ease the traffic northwards and, of course, across to the constituency of the member for Castries Southeast. And these are fair and reasonable questions to raise. I don't deny that. But why you don't come and ask me for my vote? You want to try?
Well, member.
No, Mr. Speaker. This is a delicate conversation, Mr. Speaker.
Between a district rep and his constituent?
He comes and visits my farm to find out what I'm up to and what I'm not doing. He even knows the background of where I bought the land from. He has an unusual degree of interest in me. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't know why he doesn't repair my road. Okay, Mr. Speaker, I'll move on. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are some issues. He comes in the hours when I cannot see him and catch him on the road. He monitors closely.
Honorable.
He monitors my movements. So I can never catch him on the road, on that back road.
Honorable.
But I suspect when you're building the bridge, you'll have to pass there. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I will proceed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my recollection is that during the last tenure of the former United Workers' Party government, the of road between, I think it was Lacroix Mingo, possibly Roseau, going to Ancillary, was paved. Whether, of course, a good job was done is debatable. And I've had the occasion in the past to raise questions about the quality of contractors on our roads. I will never ever forget, Mr. Speaker, the paving of the piece of road from Lacaille on to Tomaso during the height of the reconstruction of the roads. Mr. Speaker, that was given to C.O. Williams, and that was one of the worst pieces of construction I've ever seen in St. Lucia. So much so, if you look at it right now, you notice it's breaking apart and there's constant repairing of that piece of road. Now, when I spoke to engineers afterwards, they were suggesting that the method may not have been the best methodology. The point, however, is this, that in this case, it's not the government who selected contractors, it's the Caribbean Development Bank at the end of the day on the advice of the local tenders board. But we need to have this thing clarified. Whether this stretch of road for which millions was spent sometime between 2011 and 2016 is also going to be reconstructed under this new regime. The second thing is, I think the minister and the member for Castries North need to give the House a clear indication of the likely cost of that road. Now, I chose my words carefully, Mr. I said likely. And I know that there are some members who are petrified of cost overruns. That's okay. And we know the history behind that. We know the history, Mr. Speaker. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I recall occasion during a debate, I raised this issue of cost with a member for Castries North. And I said to him, and I have not the time, Mr. Speaker, that the cost which he quoted at the time for that road will be far exceeded by the time that road is completed. And we are on our way, aren't we? We are on our way. So I believe that the member for Castries North, whenever he addresses us, should give us some kind of indication of the likely cost without prejudicing those who may bid for the room. Mr. Speaker, I have sat in this House since the general elections of 2016. It has been done before. And I have heard a lot that I have chosen to. But when you allow the door to be open, Mr. Speaker, then it's only fair that an opportunity be given to let those who are affected by the opportunity you gave to respond. It's fairness. And I know you're a fair man. Mr. Speaker, this issue of the Salaries Review Commission. And like the member for Castries Southeast who complained about what people said in the social media. I myself have had to take the opportunity to respond and clarify the, not you about, that's my point, I'm talking about you explaining Salaries Review Commission, referring to it. I have myself had to take to the social media to refute some of the allegations. And in fact, to point out that the new salaries for ministers and parliamentarians were in effect from last September. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's just so unfortunate that these increases happened at a time when we had to face the COVID pandemic because it casts a certain color. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Speaker, this is the history. The Salaries Review Commission was activated by the former Prime Minister and member for Castries North. They appointed a committee to review salaries. The committee presented a preliminary report, and members are correct when they say that based on the preliminary report, the then cabinet decided, lawfully and illegally in my view, to increase the salaries of permanent secretaries, to increase the salaries of deputy permanent. It was unlawful because the report had not been laid in Parliament and therefore did not enjoy the force of law. Be that as it may, the former government of the Labour Party did not interfere with that because I believe at the time the former Prime Minister was under considerable pressure from the management of the civil service to deal with the problem, and he was in fact in his own way paving for these salaries to be paid. Let me say this, Mr. Speaker. Politicians should never begin to play politics with salaries of politicians. If all members of this House are aware, I have never said a thing. I don't enter into that debate. I'm aware that the last increase that was given to parliamentarians was all the way sometime in 2004. 2000? No, the report was 1998, but I think the payments were made around 1999 onwards, something like that. And there can be no question that this was blatantly unfair and unjust. And the reason why the Salaries Review Commission was created was to prevent a situation where Cabinet itself decided its own increases and latched on to increases of public servants. That's what happened. When the current government got in office, and I will make a little detour, Mr. Speaker, and say, I will never name names. Never. Members of this Parliament, when I was Prime Minister, has come to me on personal issues and other issues. I'll never say what they came to discuss with me or what support they, I'll never. I don't think it's ethical. I don't think it's right. And none of us should do this. If I come to see you on a matter, I expect you treat it as as a conversation between two colleagues who are members of parliament seeking assistance and support for constituents or otherwise. I am happy to say, Mr. Speaker, that in fact there was one matter, and I recall approaching one minister in this current government who resolved the matter. And I have met him and I said, thank you for resolving that matter for X constituent or Y constituent. I heard publicly about it. But it is also a fact, Mr. Speaker, that I had several representations made to me by persons whom I shall not name, asking me to pay the recommended salaries. And when we got into the reports were interim reports, we had the commission to sit and to complete the reports. That's what happened. So subsequent reports were submitted to the government. When all the reports were in and my own colleagues were concerned about the issue of remuneration, I made it very clear that given the fact that we were asking civil servants to take 0, 0 or the like, I did not think that this is the right time to increase salaries. But you know what triggered the matter before the courts? Very simply. This is a matter that should have never reached the doors of a courthouse. All the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance had to do was to meet with the leader of the opposition, and I understand there were meetings, sit down and work out how this matter would be implemented. And a whole range of individual people began to get benefits, including, of course, duty-free vehicles. And the government started to cherry pick and say they're going to give this, they're going to give that. That is when a legal basis was firmly established to proceed by way of a court matter. And that's really the history. And as I said, it is a matter of deep regret that all of this has coincided with the COVID matter. But while I believe parliamentarians have to handle the issues of salaries with honor, with dignity, with fairness, with openness, with transparency, it should never be a matter that we seek to play politics with. Now, Mr. Speaker, I go to the Bob Linquist report, or the Bob Linquist, shall I say, investigation. I have never said anything about that in this House, Mr. Speaker. Never, ever. I will not do it today. I've heard the member from Migu South in his rebuttals, when he knows that no one can rebut to him, carve his own story about what took place and what has taken place. At that point, Mr. Speaker, it is pointless to engage in an open exchange, so I have chosen to say nothing. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? The time will come when I will have to say my bit. And I will have to give the history. I will have to give the history. I will have to tell Parliament how it is that an application was made to a Florida court to allow for the investigation of certain individuals. Now, I don't know where that is. But I will find out soon, Mr. Speaker, and I will have my say on that matter. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, today we heard all kinds of things about unemployment figures. Tanto. All kinds of things about unemployment figures. Now, it's very interesting that this government touts as its fundamental achievement the reduction of unemployment. Now, Mr. Speaker, whether they like it or not, the highest growth rate ever recorded in the last 15, 20 years was the Labour Party in 2006. As a member for Castries would say, put that in your pipe and smoke it. That's right. The highest growth rate. And you may say, oh, it's Cricket World Cup, as a member for Migu South. Oh, that was Cricket World Cup. You all give people incentives all over the place. But that's a fact. That's right. office, St. Lucia began to experience its lowest rate of employment, I think either 16 or 15.5%. Now, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And we are supposed to be the failures of unemployment. When we assumed office in 2011, unemployment was about 22.5 or thereabouts, or whatever the case is. And I promised myself I'll work with the Social Economic Review at the next debate. And then we were able, despite the austerity and the difficulties of the time, to contain it and in fact keep it, I think, thereabouts, annualized about 21.5%. It was on a downward trajectory. I don't know what this big thing is about. Now, Mr. Speaker, I said this government comes to the House without contrition. They do not know and understand why stop fighting and go into senseless debates about growth rates and this and that. There's a point at which the people of this country are tired of all of this. Because you see, they don't want that. What they want to find out is how we're going to deal with their distressing situation. Open the debate, bring a motion to the House, and let us, between us, debate what we should be doing to address the difficulties and the needs and the anxieties of the people of St. Lucia, provided that you're willing to make other concessions. And see the difference. Now, Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is, yes, this government got a growth rate of 3.7 in 2017, but it's amazing how they're counting it as theirs, you know, and they're beating their chest. But any growth rate you got in 2017 was because of 2016. That's the reality. And since they accelerated. But you know what? You know what? The Minister of Finance comes to this House and says that we're likely to suffer a downward spiral of GDP, 10% of GDP, and he quotes his friend at the central bank, I believe, who says it could actually even be minus 20%. Whether that is so or not, it is debatable. But you want to tell me that if a country is going to face a negative growth rate of 20%, that we will come here and argue about roads? Shouldn't we be arguing about a plan? How do we exit St. Lucia from such a debilitating growth rate? Isn't that what the debate should be about? And both of us have interest in it. Not only because of the needs of the country, of our constituents, but we have a general election, and whoever is elected with a mess. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. That is what we face. So why we want to argue about that for? Who did better? And of course the memorable lines, the member for Castries Southeast, your best. What is how you put it again? Well, don't say it again, let me hear you. The Cocolorum speaks. I don't want to hear the Cocolorum. What are you saying? What are you saying? Your worst year is better than our best year. You know, it's a word. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, I don't think, and you, I can't speak to the member for Miku South because he's used some colorful adjectives to describe me and my presentations in this House. And of course, Mr. Speaker, you haven't stopped him, eh? You allowed it, Mr. Speaker, but I didn't protest, Mr. Speaker. I didn't. I understand those things sometimes. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I really believe that we are doing a disservice to the people of this country. The current regime is doing a disservice to the people of the country. And let us begin to face the new reality that COVID will be with us for a very long time. And let us begin to fashion an approach that will ease the pain and distress of our citizens. I say no more, Mr. Speaker. I thank you.
Member for Castries North. Honorable Member Castries North, before you, honorable members, earlier I asked whether the member for Castries, not Castries, before North would have returned. And the only reason I asked that, just to answer two questions, because he did at the time we were making reference to the unemployment numbers. And the information so presented to me is that the lowest on record from 2005 is 14%. 14% unemployment rate. To 2007, 14%. And just whilst you're preparing the other question, I could assure the member for Castries South that the warrant is in fact signed. And I am assured of that. And the general warrant, I keep saying Mr. Honorable Member for Castries South, is in fact signed and is in order. Continue. Honorable Member Castries. No.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to, Mr. Speaker, in my attempt to support the motion, to do something that I don't often do when I speak in this honorable House. And that is to attempt to rebut and to debunk some of the statements made by the honorable gentleman on the opposite side. But I believe, Mr. Speaker, it is necessary at times to deal with statements made in the chamber, particularly as, in my opinion, may not be necessary, as we are all politicians with one common philosophy, no matter what side we may take. But I'm sure the intention, when speaking to colleagues, whether on this side or the other side, I always get the feeling that there is a very rich sense of wanting to serve the people in a meaningful way. And so we conduct ourselves in a way to try and achieve our goals and our objectives. And in so doing, we tend to perform in a way that blazes the trail to ensure that we gather the necessary support from the people who give us their support over the years. This morning, Mr. Speaker, the debate which was led following the Prime Minister's presentation by the leader of the opposition, my good friend, member for Castries East, made a number of statements, Mr. Speaker, which I will attempt to address to provide clarity and to underscore a number of things. There is a saying, Mr. Speaker, that the more things change, the more they remain the same. on the Millennium Highway, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister, Parliamentary Representative rather, for Castries Southeast alluded to this one. Tunnel vision, road going through the minister's property, and it was for his own economic benefit, etc. I shall not go through with this. Southeast. But, Mr. Speaker, I recalled, Mr. Speaker, as Minister for Health during the period 1992 to 1996, 97, the debates, or rather the negotiations which I engaged in with PAHO, with the CAI for Development and the World Bank for the redevelopment of Victoria Hospital as a modern hospital rather than move to a new site, which originally the intention was for cul-de-sac. It was felt then that rather than move to a new site, which may cost much more money to operate, it was better to use the hospital and maximize of Victoria Hospital with a modern facility, maintaining the old infrastructure, demolishing the Duke of Edinburgh Award building, the wing which houses then, recently, the pediatric ward, and to put a modern facility, Mr. Speaker, second to none in the region, as the new Victoria Hospital. PAHO approved, CAI for Development approved, and we were on the verge of signing off on the deal with plans and all feasibilities done. Finance feasibility, design feasibility, technical feasibility, structural feasibility, everything done. But by 1997, we lost the election. The new government came, changed course, and said, we are building a hospital on the Millennium. I didn't object. I don't think I even attacked the then government for having changed course. Again in 1992 to 1996, Mr. Speaker, we thought that there was a need to provide health insurance to our people because of the fact that too many people were beginning, or not beginning, but were experiencing the difficulty in being able to finance their health insurance, particularly, Mr. Speaker, since we had arrangements with Martinique, where most of our tertiary health services were being provided on an agreement that the cost to government was so exorbitant that there was need to come up with legislation for the establishment of a national health insurance. We got assistance, Mr. Speaker, from the Commonwealth Secretariat with a consultant in St. Lucia. Legislation was put in place. A project office was, Speaker, and when the then government came into office, they said, we don't want to go into health insurance. We don't believe that's what St. Lucia needs. What St. Lucia needs is universal health care. And they went along with it, and that was the time when the whole diabetic research was done to declare St. Lucia as having the highest rate of diabetes in the world, even though I contested it, because I felt it was not broad-based enough. It was specific to St. Lucia, and none of the other islands or other nations had done it using the same yardstick to determine which island, which country had the highest number. But we never, Mr. Speaker, for once accused the government of having aborted the national health insurance. We never for once. As a matter of fact, when I came in, Mr. Speaker, in 2006, we continued to support NHI in the form of what was introduced as universal health coverage. We continued national stadium. Mr. Speaker, the national stadium, and from far back as my stint as Minister for Sports, we looked at the proposal for a national stadium. We looked at Lavier-Salé, which is really where Beauséjour is located, more or less in that vicinity, as being the most suitable place for a national stadium. We studied rainfalls, and we realized that Beauséjour was the area with the least rainfall in the north, and that we'll put it in that area because we felt that's where your population is, and that is the best place for it. Then later on, we looked at Shock, and then cul-de-sac, and the preference was most possibly cul-de-sac, notwithstanding we had also looked at a site near the Windward and Leeward Brewery place. All of these were plans in the making. But the government came, and the government decided, rather than go to near the brewery, we will go to that location. We never, ever challenge the government in any way to criticize. So I believe, Mr. Speaker, there's need for some level of understanding and mutual respect to the extent that governments can change their minds. Government can change course. Government can opt for a model that is different to a previous government. And government can also change their course even on a decision that they previously made up and say, that decision which we took last week, we believe it's the wrong decision, and so we can amend the course. And Mr. Speaker, that is the essence of government, to listen, to learn, to understand, to see things differently, to change course when we believe it is a better decision, and at the same time, to come back and to say, we probably made a mistake. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition started on the issue of OFID. And I think the leader of the opposition more or less guided his members down a path that made them believe that the OFID proposal or the OFID investigation or what have you, because he indicated that there was a project of $34.1 million for the extension of the Millennium Highway, which included a roundabout. And when the leader of the opposition spoke, he gave the impression that OFID was was providing a loan for the construction of the road. Because he made the comparison between what we have come here to debate today, Mr. Speaker, and to say that everything was in place. That the terms and conditions with OFID was already established, and that the road would have started from Bannon's Bay to the roundabout, the new roundabout at the foot of the bridge, and onto the East Coast Road. Of course, that's what it was. But the mission, Mr. Speaker, was a mission merely to investigate government's intention in the year 2016 to undertake a host of other projects within the country. Now, I wonder if the government, the opposition sat here, and the now government sat on the other side, we may have said then that these are election projects. We may have said then, because today I'm hearing whatever we're doing now, including program, the RIMP program, the Road Improvement Maintenance Program, are all electioneering projects. Okay? But, Mr. Speaker, you understand that we've been speaking about this RIM 4. This is the fourth time that successive governments have undertaken road improvement management programs. This one is the fourth one. They have undertaken road improvement management program. But we have been negotiating with the Taiwanese, Mr. Speaker, from since 2018. 2018 we have been negotiating. We have been back and forth trying to formulate the agreements, etc., and finally it came through. But, Mr. Speaker, the OFID program was really, and there's an aid memoir, at some stage I can make it a document of the House, Mr. Speaker. It was a group dispatched by OFID to come and discuss with the intentions for development in the country. It said the contents of the aid memoir were discussed and confirmed at the wrap-up meeting chaired by Ms. Tracy Polius, the Permanent Secretary, then the Permanent Secretary in Planning, Development, etc., okay, and the PS in Finance on the 21st of April 2016, agreements are, and it says, agreements are subject to approval of the authorities of OFID and the government of St. Lucia. So even at that point, Mr. Speaker, they were just ideas, looking at potential for the Castries-Grosley Highway from Shock to Grosley and the Millennium Highway. Even at that point, Mr. Speaker, they're saying that whatever was agreed at that meeting, it would be subject to the approval of the government of St. Lucia and the OFID. Now, this, Mr. Speaker, simply says that my dear friend, when intervention, gave the impression that it was in such a very advanced state that we just abandoned the project and moved on with a new project with the government of the United Kingdom under the deferred fund. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
on the point of order,
the total project.
I don't want to, on the point of order, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to disturb the member of Castries North. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to refer him to the July 2015 mission and the project proposal for the Millennium Highway and the proposals for what I spoke of. I don't want to disturb the minister, but there was a specific project proposal in 2015 for the Millennium Highway, and the other visit in 2016 was for the highway and the Grosley Highway. And I would like the minister to see whether OFID did not approve of these loans and whether these loans were not cancelled. This is all. I'm not disputing anything else, but as a minister, please, isn't that the truth?
And so, Mr. Speaker, the total project cost then, which was proposed, was US 26.77 million, which included taxes, etc., etc. The project to be co-financed by OFID and the government of St. Lucia. It is proposed that OFID's participation will be a loan in the amount of US $16.16 million. Mr. Speaker, the mission that the minister spoke of was the mission of April 14, 2021. What I'm saying, at that point, OFID had not signed, the government had not signed, there were proposals, and they were saying that it was upon the acceptance of both the government and OFID. The point I'm merely making here, Mr. Speaker, is that what we have come here to do, Mr. Speaker, is counterpart funding. Counterpart funding in which the government of the United Kingdom under UK CIF is giving the government of St. Lucia a grant. It is not a loan. So in that case, you ask yourself the question. At one point we say, well, we should have gone with the Hirona International Airport because we're getting private sector participation. The government will not have to invest any money, and this time we're going for a loan. The OFID matter was a loan. The government said, we will go with the UK CIF. It is a grant. And I'll go into this one a little later in terms of the details of the grant. The majority of the money, Mr. Speaker, and I'll give the details of it, for the project will come from DFID, okay? It is not a loan, Mr. Speaker. The Millennium Highway project, Mr. Speaker, will not be financed by a loan. The only component of that, Mr. Speaker, is the component to do with consultancies, feasibilities, and payment for land acquisition, etc., etc. And it is not a top-up. It's not a situation where we have $96 million and we put borrowing more money, and the intention is to use the money for other things. It is all within the project document, within the project rules, that we're going to the CDB to get those funds to do a number of things, and that I shall explain later. Tender Evaluation Committee, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when the member asked about the Tenders Evaluation Committee, who appointed the Tenders Evaluation Committee, I was almost stunned, because I'm trying to figure out, well, how does the minister probably get involved in the appointment of the Project Evaluation Committee? And so I thought, well, it's probably, I am not totally on top of the situation, that I have a responsibility to appoint a Tenders Evaluation Committee, and I failed in my responsibility. But then, after I did my research, Mr. Speaker, the question of the Central Tenders Board, which is the vehicle which we're using here in this case, is enshrined in the Procurement and Stores Regulations. And under Part 3 of the Procurement and Stores Regulations, Mr. Speaker, Section 15, it speaks of technical committees. And it says, the Central Tenders Board may appoint technical committees as may be considered necessary to evaluate any tender and for pre-qualification of contractors. And 2, it says, a copy of any report by such committee appointed under paragraph 1 may be made available to the minister. And in this case, it refers to the minister as the Minister for Finance. That's a committee. It says, and you can refer to your Finance Administration Act and the Procurement and Stores Regulations. It says, Part 3, Section 15, headed Technical Committees. The Central Tenders Board may appoint technical committees as may be considered necessary to evaluate any tender and for the pre-qualification of contractors. And 2, a copy of any report by such committee appointed under paragraph 1 may be made available to the minister. That's according to the Procurement and Stores rules. Mr. Speaker, to satisfy the minister's question, the process for the Millennium Highway and West Coast Road has been ongoing. And in the process, Mr. Speaker, the matter, based on all of the guidelines established by DFID and the CDB being the agency appointed by DFID to oversee all of the projects throughout the region, because it's not only St. Lucia who benefited from this grant funding from the UK government. It's from Jamaica all the way down to Guyana. And the former Prime Minister knows very well, and he indicated, or the member for Castries South indicated, the genesis of this whole arrangement in the time of Prime Minister David Cameron. So St. Lucia benefited. At that time, the then government, Mr. Speaker, thought that the DFID, the UK CIF, United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Fund program, the allocation for St. Lucia would be better utilized on the North-South Link Road from Grosley to Dennery. And the reason for this, Mr. Speaker, is that the terms and the conditions of the UK CIF grant was that it would generate and bolster economic activity in the country. The intention of the grant encouraged the islands of the Caribbean to be able to be more productive, to generate greater efficiencies in the economy, and to be able to stand up in the global environment and to compete and trade with any nation in the world. But when we got into office, Mr. Speaker, time was running out. And UKCIF said, the United Kingdom government said, September 2017 is the deadline by which to end this thing. If you do not make a commitment by September of 2017, you stand a chance of losing this grant funding. We looked at what was being proposed by the government, the previous administration, Mr. Speaker, and we realized that notwithstanding the government had committed or had indicated its intention to commit the £3 million to the construction of the North-South Link Road, we also realized, Mr. Speaker, that a feasibility study which was conducted by Santec and a company called Integral Good out of Atlanta, who did preliminary studies, were proposing, or rather estimated, that the cost of the North-South Link Road would have been 1.6 billion EC dollars. Okay? At that time, Mr. Speaker, we realized that if it is the cost of the road, if it is 1.6 thereabout billion EC dollars, and all we have is $32+ million based on the rate as we say, it's really 42, I think. We really wasn't in any position to get the works going, because all that was done by Santec and Integral Good was really feasibilities. They were not detailed, they had not done all of the socio-economic exercises, etc. Beg your pardon? Yeah, it's all part of it, yeah, the CDB. Yes, as a matter of fact, the CDB funded it, yes. So we realized we couldn't do it. The deadline that was given to us, Mr. Speaker, we said, okay, when we looked at all of the possible potential projects that we could have engaged in, which had a 12% return, we decided the Millennium Road, Millennium Highway, and the West Coast, considering the deterioration that was taking place on both of these roads, would be the ideal place to put those funds, and the UK government accepted it. And that's how we diverted the funds into this area and saw the need for not wanting into another loan arrangement to rehabilitate just the Millennium Highway. In the process, all that has been done, Mr. Speaker, according to the section of the procurement guidelines, the Ministry of Finance appointed the Bid Evaluation Committee, which was activated this year. And the committee comprised 3 members of the Department of Infrastructure, of individuals who worked or who have been working at the Department of Infrastructure even during the time of the member opposite, the leader of the opposition. Then a representative from the Department of Finance, who happens to be an economist, Department of Finance, and the Assistant General Manager of the consulting firm, which is FDL. That comprises, Mr. Speaker, the Bid Evaluation Committee, which indicates that in all of this exercise, even the notion or the perception of the government interfering, Mr. Speaker, is certainly dismissed. Because I would not, Mr. Speaker, as minister, I appreciate you asked, and I'm trying to explain, because when you ask a question, while I answer you, but I also speak to the nation. So the nation understands exactly what is happening, because it's important. Because the nation listens to parliamentarians, and the nation more or less form their opinions and decisions based on what is heard from the parliamentarians. And if a member opposite asks a good question, if that question is not addressed adequately, it may be construed that the appointment of the Tenders Board of the Evaluation Committee was interfered with by either the minister or the Ministry of Infrastructure. And so I lay this matter to rest. Mr. Speaker, the The financing of the Millennium Highway West Coast Road, and many times members try to ask, what's the cost? And I believe the member for VF4 South also this evening requested or rather inquired as to the potential cost of the project. And I feel, and I'm proud to at least give some information. And I believe after he asked, and having heard other members opposite, Mr. Speaker, I believe the next House meets, I will present a full report on where we are as far as the project is concerned. Mr. Speaker, the proposed project will be financed in the following ways. A loan from the government to the government of St. Lucia by the CDB of an amount not exceeding the equivalent of $7.945 million, which is what we are here this evening debating and for which we anticipate approval. That, Mr. Speaker, represents 15% of the project cost. 15% of project cost is what forms our commitment to the project. Then a grant to the government of St. Lucia of an amount not exceeding the equivalent of $27.83 million, which is US $35.342 million, from CDB's SFR, which is the allocation from resources provided by the United Kingdom through the Department of International Development under the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Fund, UKCIF resources, request representing 67% of the project cost. So 67% comes from the United Kingdom. Counterpart funding of EC 24.61 million, representing 17% of project costs, to finance land acquisition, project preparation, institutional strengthening, project management, and to partly finance infrastructure works. What this means, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister this morning alluded to it, that the project will have a number of components. So it's not just a project of a contractor coming in, ripping off the surface, rolling it, getting the new levels done, and paving it. But there are a number of components in it, Mr. Speaker. There's a question of land acquisition because of what is. While some parts of the road will be kept, there's some parts which will be straightened, some land acquisition undertaken, and as you know, Mr. Speaker, along the West Coast Road, there are a number of small entrepreneurs along the West Coast Road, in the Roseau Valley and other parts of the West Coast Road. The government now will move in and acquire some of those lands to create a safe buffer for those individuals so they do not get run down by vehicular traffic, and to put all of the road safety measures in place, barriers and other measures, other road furniture, to ensure that those persons are protected. Mr. Speaker, the cost also, the amount also entails the whole question of project preparation, the institutional strengthening. Mr. Speaker, one of the things we often do when we engage in major projects, even with the Taiwanese program, is to insist that while the arrangement with the Exim Bank of Taiwan is to hire a Taiwanese firm based on the rules and regulations of the Exim Bank philosophy of having an involvement in the execution or implementation of the project, is to ensure that local contractors are engaged and they can get the benefit of what you call transfer of technology and institutional strengthening. Those contractors would bid to the OECC, which is the Taiwanese construction firm, and they would negotiate with those contractors out of the pool of local contractors to determine who those contractors are. The institutional strengthening, Mr. Speaker, is really to assist the Department of Infrastructure itself in strengthening the skills, learning from and engaging in training activities that will make them even more equipped engineers and technicians and other workers on the project. And Mr. Speaker, the issue of project management. Project management, Mr. Speaker, we have all found out that if there is a shortcoming in government, is that of project management. And it permeates not only in government, it permeates all the way down to the small contractor, the middle contractor, and the large contractors. We have had projects, Mr. Speaker, in this country, where even some of the largest contractors are unable to respond in a timely manner, in an efficient way, and in a dynamic method of executing the project and to finish the project on time. All of this is a question of project management. And this, Mr. Speaker, in this one here, we have this of the CDB grant to ensure that there is project management skills and institutional strengthening provided to the people, to the technicians, and the Department of Infrastructure, and also those persons, those small contractors who will be engaged in the project. Mr. Speaker, the project proposes the rehabilitation of selected sections right through the road. No significant negative environmental impacts are expected. It is broken down, Mr. Speaker, and is comprised of the rehabilitation of works for the two roads, meaning the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Road, a bridge, road safety items, as I indicated early on, technical assistance and institutional support for the project. The Millennium, the cost is $32.2 million as estimated by UKCIF. The West Coast Road, Mr. Speaker, is EC $66.2 million, making up a total of $99.4 million. $99.4 million, which will interest the member for Vieux South, as he questioned the full cost of the project. According to the CDB and UKCIF, these combined costs are within the approximate figure of EC 100 million, which is available from the UKCIF grant. The costs exclude Government of St. Lucia costs such as project management and VAT. If the UK pound further reduces in value against the EC dollar, the Government of St. Lucia would have to provide a top-up capital budget. And Mr. Speaker, that is a situation which often happens when grants or even loans are disbursed in foreign currency, which is apart from the United States dollar, which we are pegged to. Mr. Speaker, I think one of the most critical components of the project, as identified by UKCIF and CDB, it says that the project includes provision for national institutional support in the Ministry of Infrastructure for the project period. If technical assistance, design and supervision is provided by a national firm, this will provide work for 3.5 years from start of design reviews to end of construction. I want to repeat this, Mr. Speaker. They're saying, if technical assistance, that is design and supervision, by a national firm, this will provide work for 3.5 years from start of design reviews to end of construction, plus the contract defects liability period. 3.5 years of employment, Mr. Speaker. All the road rehabilitation works, Mr. Speaker, including strengthening retaining walls and road safety features, etc., should be within capacity of national contracting companies. While the two road components may be awarded to separate contractors, it is recommended not to separate the bridge works, as this could lead to project implementation difficulties. So in other words, whatever we do, we may award the contract, I say we, but the contracts may be awarded to either one or two contractors, but in either part of the contract, the bridge component must remain in one component, so you do not have the problem of coordination and implementation in that the bridge is a critical part of the West Coast Road to avoid any project management difficulties. Mr. Speaker, I go on to state that the national contractors may therefore be encouraged to team up with international contractors where they need additional technical expertise. Notwithstanding these arrangements, the construction works could be required will need a labor force. And I want to emphasize this. The work to be undertaken, Mr. Speaker, according to DFID and the CDB, will require a labor force, which includes artisans, equipment operators, foremen, supervisors, etc. And this is not me writing this, Mr. Speaker. This is not the Ministry of Infrastructure writing this. This has been written by those who are involved in the technical, who are doing the assessment, who are doing the feasibilities, who are looking at the social impact of the project, how it impacts on our community, how our people are impacted, and what are the benefits for them. And it is saying that this project will impact throughout its period on all of those persons along the Millennium and the West Coast Road who will be engaged in the various aspects of the project, over 100 persons. This would include opportunities for women. Women, an issue often flagged, whether it is at the World Bank or at ILO or WHO, the involvement of women in national development. And oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, when we speak of construction, oftentimes we think of men. Oftentimes we think of men. And I know, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very proud in my constituency that many small projects, the men who get the projects always employ a few ladies, whether it's workers, or whether they just have to hold a sign for stop and go, or whether to assist to hand tools. A decision or policy, rather, to engage the women. In this case, the DFID and the CDB is saying it would include opportunities for women. For example, at the current bridge site in Canaries, traffic management is provided by women. Now, Mr. Speaker, when I speak of the number of jobs to be provided for a period of 3.5 years, I spoke of it early on, I am reminded of what seemed to have been some humor on the other side of the launch of the project sometime last year thereabouts, where it was said, it didn't come from my mouth, so it probably came out from somebody else, that the project was starting the following day or the following week. But, Mr. Speaker, indeed, what we signed on that day last week was really the consultancy for the design. And work actually started the following week. Not in terms of physical excavation, etc. But the consultant, FDL, took to the ground, with the support of the Ministry of Infrastructure, to do all of the investigations, to look at the pavement, to look at what exists at this time, to take all of the surveys, all of the levels, and to make a determination in beginning to put together the design for the road. And that continued for quite a while up to the recent past. Mr. Speaker, we have come to the point at this time where all of the preliminaries have been achieved. All of the preliminaries have been achieved, Mr. Speaker. And last week, Thursday thereabouts, I think, which the member requested or really asked how it was selected, that is the Tenders Board, through its Bid Evaluation Committee, received and opened 12 tenders, and those are what we call the pre-qualification tenders. tendering process. 12 companies who applied and is now under evaluation to determine which of the companies that can, which, it is public information. Which are the companies, big one? I'll give it to you. Which are the companies who will pre-qualify for consideration to bid on the final project, because the intention is to get the project off the ground in July. The companies who more or less presented bids to the Central Tenders Board, the applications came from Jamaica, Trinidad, China, St. Lucia, Canada, Trinidad and Tobago, Turks and Caicos, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Canada, Suriname, and St. Lucia. From Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, Surrey Paving and Aggregate. From Trinidad and Tobago, St. SL Construction Limited. From China, Sinohydro Corporation Limited. From St. Lucia, Nationwide Mobile Concrete Suppliers Limited. From Canada, Municipal Enterprise Limited. From Trinidad and Tobago, Junior Sami Contractors Limited. From Turks and Caicos, Herzog Caribbean Limited. From Trinidad and Tobago again, Kusal Construction Company Limited. From, yes, they're back, Kusal Construction Company Limited from Trinidad and Tobago. From Barbados, C.O. Williams Construction, which is really the head company or the parent company of C.O. Williams St. Lucia. Canada, Belvedere Place Development. From Suriname, Animengs Mats Cheng Pij Batali Envy from Suriname. And from St. Lucia again, Construction and Industrial Equipment Limited. Those, Mr. Speaker, rather these, Mr. Speaker, are the 12 companies who submitted applications to the Central Tenders Board for pre-qualification. Mr. Speaker, there's one aspect which I need to deal with, and it keeps coming up here in this House ever so often when we speak of infrastructure or when we speak of building of roads and bridges, etc. And oftentimes, and sometimes I'm a little surprised by the member for Vieux South when he seemed to be alarmed or surprised of the cost, as we put it, of the cul-de-sac. Knowing full well that this project, the investigations were done immediately after Thomas, when the Japanese delegation visited St. Lucia in 2010 after the hurricane. And it was followed up with the then Prime Minister and his cabinet headed by the Infrastructure Minister on the whole issue of flooding in the cul-de-sac valley and the implications of flooding in as far as the economic activity of the country during a disaster, particularly one of a tropical storm which poured rain, registering a 1 in 50-year event. And we all know what happened then. We had never seen flooding of this magnitude in the cul-de-sac valley. Mr. Speaker, the decision to build the bridge in cul-de-sac, and it wasn't only cul-de-sac, there were 3 bridges. There was Wavin Poisson, there was cul-de-sac, and there was the other one in Odessa. Those were the 3 bridges which were identified. There's the cul-de-sac main road, yes, and there's the other one at not too far from Ferrens Bridge, the Ferrens Bridge. Ferrens, Wavin Poisson, and cul-de-sac. But, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese put together an envelope and said this will be the cost, or this will be the expenditure to be made on the 3 bridges without even any feasibility, but they put in place an envelope, and we were to work, the government really had to work with this. The activities leading up, Mr. Speaker, to this present moment found out that after all of the feasibilities and all of the costing feasibilities, all of the engineering feasibilities, the results indicated we can only consider building what I call 1.5 bridges. Because it's not just a bridge, Mr. Speaker, it also entailed a number of interventions to resolve the issue of flooding in the cul-de-sac basin. So what the Japanese are going to do in cul-de-sac, Mr. Speaker, is just not to put 2 I-beams across the river and put slabs on it and say we have a bridge and say it costs $42 million. It's much more than this. The studies which had to be done, Mr. Speaker, to determine the hydrology of the river in terms of the flow and all of this thing, Mr. Speaker, because it's not water running down a hill, it's water settling in a floodplain. And it is likely, if the hydrology, Mr. Speaker, isn't adequate, you are likely to have much more rapid flooding than ever before. The Japanese were the ones, Mr. Speaker, who undertook all of the feasibilities, design, finance, engineering, you name it, all of the feasibilities, costing, Speaker. We were merely the recipients of donor funds and participants as observers, as the invited representatives from the ministry on a number of occasions, either to witness the first opening of the bids, the pre-qualifications, etc. And I must say to you, Mr. Speaker, I was not a part of the delegations that visited. I felt it was necessary that only technical people should go. I do not believe as a politician I should have gone. So at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese came up after 3 bids, Mr. Speaker, after 3 bid openings, not being able to get a company that would have been able to present a costing that fitted into the envelope. The Japanese finally came out with the design contractor, the company called Nippon Kyo. Nippon Kyo, it's a company in Japan. The supervising engineers, Mr. Speaker, will be the Department of Infrastructure, Ports and Energy. The start date, Mr. Speaker, of the whole process was August 2017. However, we sort of revised that, and the start date now is June 2020. So whereas in the beginning, the start date was established as August 2017, we have now found ourselves, because of the delays in deciding on a contractor, we have found ourselves in June of 2020. Proposed end date, Mr. Speaker, the contract duration, 24 months. The contract value, Mr. Speaker, is Eastern Caribbean, $37.5 million. And it is being funded, as I said previously, the government of Japan looks to be undertaken comprises rehabilitation of the cul-de-sac bridge. Now, Mr. Speaker, even the statement that the works to be undertaken is really the rehabilitation of the cul-de-sac bridge, it entails, as I said earlier on, it entails a number of activities. One of the most critical activities, Mr. Speaker, is the river retraining. Works upstream coming downstream. Because the problem with the cul-de-sac basin, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that because the river is meandering, what you do have happening is a situation as you'd find in countries where you have, like Holland, where you have those floodplains and dikes build, not dikes, Mr. Speaker, but the floodplains build up and deltas emerge, and it creates a problem, and then it continues. In our case, we do have the meandering, but the meandering causes flows on either side of the river, causing flooding in both directions. So what will happen, Mr. Speaker? The river will be retrained, there will be berms established, and a system that will allow for an elimination of the overflow of the banks to be able to keep the rivers, the basin or the cul-de-sac basin free of flooding. There's also need, Mr. Speaker, to develop approach walls to the bridge, creating a higher elevation with special material possibly coming from Japan. And that is necessary, Mr. Speaker, because those of you who traverse that road and traverse the bridge, you'll recognize that that bridge is very flat, just a few feet off the riverbed. Any flooding will run over the deck of the bridge. So it is high, but it's not sufficient. A 1 in 50-year event. And I notice, Mr. Speaker, you're looking at your clock. So please, if you mind, can you tell me how much time I have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Thank you. I'll be through in 10 minutes. So, Mr. Speaker, the design of the bridge entails a higher elevation, a wider span, and I know there was a little confusion the last time when I spoke of the span of the bridge. The span of the bridge is from one bank to the next, so that bridge will be way off the bank of the river, and it will be at a much higher elevation to ensure that there can never ever be flooding that will override or overrun the deck of the bridge. Because the bridge will be so high, Mr. Speaker, there is need to create new approaches onto the bridge. Otherwise, you will not get onto the bridge. So, again, that means cost. So it means that you now have to create approaches from way off the bridge to get onto the bridge because of its elevation. All of that, Mr. Speaker, is going to cost some money. So hence the reason, Mr. Speaker, the cul-de-sac bridge cannot be compared with the Bois d'Orange bridge. It cannot be compared with the Bonte bridge, or if I should say the Bonte bridge or the Bois d'Orange bridge cannot be compared with the Bois d'Orange bridge. The Alba bridge cannot be compared with the cul-de-sac bridge. And a number of bridges in this country can never appear or be compared with the proposed new cul-de-sac bridge. In fact, when this bridge is built, Mr. Speaker, it will be the longest bridge in St. Lucia, and it may also be considered as the most expensive. But when you speak of expense, as far as the bridge is concerned, at 42 million EC dollars, members must understand it is a bridge with $42 million. Yes, $42 million. Let me just give it to you. EC, $42 million. Okay? The contract value is 37.5, but there are other components that will take it up to $42 million. So, beg your pardon? There will be consultancies, etc., and some land acquisition in the process. So when we speak of $42 million, Mr. Speaker, we must speak of $42 million plus other infrastructural work, which includes the river retraining, new approaches, and other retaining structures to ensure that the problem of the cul-de-sac river is, which includes, what did I say? Well, which includes all of those other aspects of the construction of the cul-de-sac bridge. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I think I have addressed most of which were raised either directly or indirectly. The issue raised by the member for Denry North is that, is this the best use of money now? And I believe I've dealt with that. And I know this has been an argument ever since the issue of salaries came about, and persons indicating, why don't you use loan funds, which you have already, to pay salaries? That doesn't make sense. I noticed the member for Castries South is smiling, and the member for Castries East. They both know it just doesn't make sense. You cannot just change the use of funds and to go back into renegotiations and hope that you'll get it immediately within 30 days to pay salaries. It is for a specific purpose. It is a decision by the Japanese government to build a bridge. The Japanese government, if you go back to them and say to them, we do not want the bridge again, use the $42 million to pay public officers, they will say to you, we cannot do it. I didn't say you said so. I didn't say you said so. It's the same way, Mr. Speaker, when this government took a deliberate decision based on the OFID investigation and said, we have a different intention for the Castries-Grosley Highway. We knew off the bat that once we said to them we had a new intention, it meant we needed to go back to renegotiate, which takes time. And that is where we are at. Mr. Speaker, also the member for therefore North saying the arrangements were already there and that whether the $21 million is to add on or we already have $96 million, now we're asking for $21 million. Mr. Speaker, again, I repeat, the $96 million is really grant funding from the United Kingdom government. Our component is just like if you go to the bank and you say, I need a loan to build a house, and the bank says, well, we can only give you 75% of financing. You have to find your 25%. And that's only business. That's how business runs, except if the bank wants to give you a bonanza and tell you take 100% and go home and get your house. Mr. Speaker, there was a big project launch. I dealt with this aspect, and I also dealt with the matter pertaining to the other issues in which members were raising the use of the money. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe this government has a responsibility to all of our people, our public officers, to pay them their salary. And even if the intention is, or the proposal was to offer them a salary with a blend of bonds and cash, it is their wish to say they don't want it. But they are officers. They work for us. They work for the country. Mr. Speaker, we have a responsibility to each and every citizen in this country. And this government is not about denying the poor, the vulnerable, and the needy. We have undertaken, ever since COVID, an exercise to reach out to all of the vulnerable. I am sure members opposite will be contacted soon to assist in identifying those persons who are truly in need, whether it is to continue to receive some assistance in this current period, to assist them with meals and food so as to be able to sustain themselves. But also, Mr. Speaker, through the ILO, a proposal has been presented to St. Lucia, Guyana, and Dominica, St. Lucia being used as a pilot, to introduce what is called a public employment program to get government to identify resources within its budget through the Ministry of to engage in throughout the country. And that, Mr. Speaker, we've responded to the ILO positively, and hopefully they will be reaching out to us to assist us in the execution of the project, provide some funding and the necessary consultancy in this regard. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is my honor on this occasion to support this motion, which seeks to borrow $7.945 million as government's commitment, the component for which we are responsible to undertake the construction of the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Road. Mr. Speaker, I believe, notwithstanding the passion of each and every member of this Parliament, to reach out to the people of this country and to help them one way or the other, notwithstanding the need which we have seen to step up the provision through additional and to ensure that every child is within reach of Wi-Fi and accessibility to laptops and computers and equipping our various HRDCs with computers. Notwithstanding all of this, Mr. Speaker, we believe that this project, which is not just mortar and steel, but this project is one which is catered to help the people of this country, to help the country during any natural disaster, to be able to stand and to withstand the impact of flooding without paralyzing economic activity in the country. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this loan approval, once granted, will certainly further boost activity within the economy and provide jobs, as I articulated, to the numerous persons around the country particularly along the West Coast, to artisans, to masons, to welders, to laborers, to women, to men, and to other persons who may be there to provide goods and services to the workers who will be engaged, all of whom, most of whom, Mr. Speaker, will be St. Lucians, and probably some experts who may not, some experts with expertise not available in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I so support. Thank you.
Member for Library.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I join the debate on the motion, be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow an amount not exceeding the equivalent of US $7,945,000 from the Caribbean Development Bank's ordinary capital resources to finance the Millennium Highway and West Coast reconstruction project. So, Mr. Speaker, as I enter upon the debate, I want to note with great interest the contributions of members opposite, particularly the member for Grosile, who is rather conspicuous by his absence in the chamber at this juncture, Mr. Speaker. I wish he was there to, of course, be part and parcel of this debate as we respond. He dismissed the concerns expressed by members on this side and described the posture assumed as treasonous, simply because members of the opposition are accentuating the fact that COVID-19 and its impact must not be taken lightly, and that people are suffering in this country, and the full impact of COVID-19 is yet to be felt by this country, and of course, the most vulnerable in this country. Mr. Speaker, and in attacking members on this side, the usual target is the former Prime Minister, who has played a pivotal role in assisting this country in responding to COVID-19. And I will get to that momentarily. I remember, Mr. Speaker, the last time I had the unsurpassed glory of addressing this Honorable House, I made it clear that the former Prime Minister and the member for Viewfort South, in his central program for the social sector, addressed income, human capital, and asset poverty. It is in this intersection between access to services, income, and assets that the issue of overall poverty trends since 1997 should be examined. Because, Mr. Speaker, the former Prime Minister understands quite clearly that what makes development happen is our ability to imagine, to theorize, to invent, and to do 100 things with our minds. And all the concrete structures we see around are mere symbols of development. But true and real development comes from the people of the country. And Mr. Speaker, any serious government that wants to build economic resilience in a country, COVID or no COVID, would address themselves very seriously to a health sector that protects people from diseases that debilitate and kill. An education system that equips people with intellectual tools, nurtures inquisitiveness, etc. Through a system that attempts to match skills with the right jobs in the economy. And of course, giving policies an opportunity to reach maturity and to work for the people of the country. Many times you hear people talk about Singapore, the same size with St. Lucia, and how Singapore has done great things. It is because there has been no break in the agenda. There has been a sustained effort at social and economic development. And people are always at the heart of development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whilst members opposite consistently attack members on this side, the record speaks for itself. We made it clear that when the member for Beaufort South left office in 2006, the report card was that the economy had grown by more than 5%, and the year before was 4.6%. Unemployment was in the vicinity of 13.6%, lowest in 15 years, and wealth was more evenly distributed in the country. Indigence had been reduced significantly. Significantly, Mr. Speaker. And in this COVID-19 environment, and I remember the last time I said that most areas in the South and most areas where the most vulnerable people live in St. Lucia had no running water, no electricity. And at least today, because of the efforts of the former Prime Minister, the people in those vulnerable areas now have pipe-borne water that they can now adhere to one of the fundamental health protocols of washing their hands over running water. Very simple, Mr. Speaker. We never knew COVID was going to approach in this country. It is just that we prepared. We placed emphasis on education, including the laptop programs, that had this government not interfered with at this juncture in time, we would not have been confronted with the challenge of laptops, because we have to move education online, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thousands of people have lost their jobs and are in free fall as we speak. And then the member for Grosile says that they are doing so well, COVID or no COVID, that unemployment had declined by 9%. But what the member failed to say was that as a result of the hurricane in the other islands, thousands of St. Lucians are overseas working. Obviously, they are not looking for work in St. Lucia. And it is just automatic. But it is nothing that they have done to stimulate anything in this country to say, well, there is unemployment. And I think that type of debate in the context of our development, in the context of what is happening there, is almost, Mr. Speaker, irrelevant, because we must be concerned about the people of this country in this COVID environment, Mr. Speaker. The member for Grosile also indicated that when this government borrows, it borrows for investment purposes. In what way the borrowings for DSH constitute an investment, Mr. Speaker? To the extent that tens of millions of our dollars have been invested in DSH, a dead horse. And we are spending tens of millions of St. Lucia's dollars on keeping the dead horse on a ventilator of make-believe to give the impression that this dead horse is alive, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how can the member criticize us for insisting that people should be first, not horses? And I state categorically at this juncture, with all the boasting that's going on the opposite side, if an administration is putting horses above people, then they cannot even effectively represent the people in their respective constituencies. Not even the Creole horses. Not even the Creole horses that they can effectively represent. Far less people. And we are saying to you that people are suffering. And in whatever we do at this particular point in time, we must pay attention to the people that are suffering. So, Mr. Speaker, if last week when we came here, the entire $70-something million was set aside, for example, to deal with the challenges of the country, and we come here today to borrow for infrastructural reasons, we can see a holistic effort at trying to take care of the people of this country and to stimulate economic activity at the same time. But because of the type of spending over the past 4 years on things that have no value, millions to Permandu, millions to Lockerbie, millions in all types of direction. So COVID came and met a very vulnerable fiscal situation. So COVID-19 now bungs up with COVID-20. And that is what a local radio personality would call a kalmaja. So, Mr. Speaker, in the absence of an ambitious response to the socio-economic impact of COVID-19, people all across the communities and constituencies of this country are being impacted negatively. In the absence of strong policy responses, the COVID-19 crisis could deepen disparities between communities, even in the St. Lucia. So better resource communities are going to do much better than the poor communities. And you see, Mr. Speaker, we might end up with a situation where we have a few rich people and the majority of people are poor. Because the middle class, if they are in free fall, will disappear. And you know, Mr. Speaker, they take it lightly. Members opposite take everything lightly. That the warnings are of no consequence. We are about to open up the country. We are about to borrow for infrastructure to give people jobs to do. Those people who had their barber shops and had to close it because of COVID-19, are they going to be employed in those projects? The people with the hairdressing salon, are they going to be included in this? The people on the block, all of those people, are they going to be catered for in that works on the Millennium Highway? But you know what, Mr. Speaker? When I saw the borrowing for this highway, I thought it was another highway. Because more than a year ago, they had yellow hats like clowns clowning around the place, you know, saying that no more roller coaster. Yes, it was big excitement. And that works would commence immediately. Yes, and the impression they gave had nothing to do with designs. That there would be traffic management and everything in the country. So, Mr. Speaker, the point is, the people of this country require assistance. And they require that assistance urgently, or else by the end of 2020, thousands of families who existed above the poverty line will be below the poverty line. Mr. Speaker, look at my constituency of Labrie. Airbnb plays a pivotal role in the livelihood of the constituency, people there. We have close to 60 rooms in the People's Republic of Labrie. We have not had a single guest from mid-March. And this subsector does not know when things will recommence in the area. No support in place to deal with them because they actually incur significant costs of trying to organize those rooms to be self-employed. And Mr. Speaker, where's the Minister for Finance, the member for Miku South, last time was talking about gouvernement. And the Prime Minister must learn our language, because language is a very important part of our culture. It's not gouvernement, that people depend on gouvernement. We don't depend on gouvernement. We built our credit union, and in this dark hour in our national life, the credit union pumped in the vicinity of $1.3 million in patronage refund to give the constituency a boost. We engage in meals. The credit union took the initiative because we built it. The key to our economic salvation, provide meals to assist the efforts of government. To assist the efforts of government. No constituency should just believe that everything is government. And I can speak on behalf of my constituents that we are not leeches. The leeches are those who come to a poor country and want the country to spend over $3 million doing Batem Cheval for them. Spend millions of dollars diverting roads. A leech will come here, like those who go in our NIC funds and take millions of dollars for some Cabot Link project.
Mr. Speaker.
These are the leeches.
Understanding a point of order. Mr. Speaker, I have allowed the member from Labrie to say that in previous sessions of the House, where he has used the word leech to describe investors in this country. I would like him to desist and desist from making those statements. He may not appreciate the investment that's being made, but to use derogatory language to describe them, Mr. Speaker, of persons who have come to this country, invested their money, created jobs in this country, and are helping to promote this country every day, Mr. Speaker, I have a strong objection to him doing that.
I'm not doing that. That's not the point of order.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker.
Let me just say something. I would say that investment is a very crucial part of our economic development, and I would ask you to be very careful how you refer to persons that partake or assist us in our economic development.
Mr. Speaker, two things. One, the member from Miku South will not instruct me in this House as to what I can say or what I cannot say. I am quite conversant with the procedures of this House, and I will take no directive from the member from Miku South. And secondly, anyone who comes here, we have to take millions of dollars to divert road for. This is a small and vulnerable economy. I have every right to express in the most profound way my displeasure and my dissatisfaction with what is happening. When the Majomel Road is in a deplorable condition, it needs to be repaired. $13 million is being spent for Tioa King to divert a road. And I must come here and I will not call Tioa King a leech.
Speaker, on a point of order.
That was a honourable member.
I'm not going to yield. You have no point of order. Yes.
You do not
interrupt my presentations like
you
this.
You can interrupt under the standing order, but you do not speak, especially if you're speaking into the mic.
The what?
You do not use such language to ordinary members.
Which one? I don't know which
You want me to repeat it?
What did I say?
You do not say, man, sit down.
Oh, but they were calling us boy and
No,
all kind of
no,
things.
no. Let's be careful, honorable members. Let's be careful. Let's be careful. I will say to you again, I do not believe you have the right, and I've said before, you have the right. Any member in here has the right to freedom of expression as provided by our Constitution and our standing orders. You have that right here to speak to issues and to various things affecting us. But let's be careful how we say it. And although when you refer to the government, I see the government has been technically separate from individual members that make up the government. Yes. Government more as a collective, which includes more than just the members in here, that part, the 11 members in here. So sometimes you say government, I allow it to go by. And if you speak directly about a particular member, I will pull you up. So I allow that difference. But let's not see, and I think you can do better than that we, or the government, whatever way you said it, spend $14 million for TWACing, when the members on the government side have said previously, and many times, that the road was spent, or the money was spent, in part, I would say, for the airport development. You may differ, but it has been said. So do not make a blank statement like this, that the money was spent for that. I'm not telling you don't say what you have to say, but I'm just saying, do not just make a blank statement that it was just spent for that, for him. Continue and be careful, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I will not sustain any back and forth with you. You know my style. This is your chamber and you preside. But you see, Mr. Speaker, I spend a great deal of time making myself quite conversant with the standing orders of the House and how to behave. Now, I have seen the member from Miku South do and say things in this House, including that he's not going to withdraw when you ask him to withdraw. But I'm not going there, Mr. Speaker, but I will say something very clearly, Mr. Speaker. You see that era where people from abroad comes into our country, the neoliberal market model, where people believe we don't want trade unions, we don't want taxation, we always demanding things. You see this St. Lucia Labour Party born out of the trade union movement. Any investor that will be coming into this country must respect the laws of this country, including the labor laws. We have to protect the workers of this country. And I do not believe that our resources should be utilized for the benefit of foreigners and at the expense of the people of this country. For too long, over the past 4 years, the people of St. Lucia does not matter. It is just an emphasis on horses. And even Jesus Christ got upset when he went to the temple, when they were gambling in the temple of the Lord. And I was made in his own image and likeness. And leaders must always show emotion and passion, Mr. Speaker. And this is why the people of Labrie sent me there to represent their interest, and I will represent it with everything that I have. And I will not be intimidated by any member on the opposite side. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, I know from time to time you are allergic to some words. I want you, the member for Labrie wants you to write on a little piece of paper for me all the words you are allergic to, Mr. Speaker, so I could avoid using any language. Because you see, when you're allergic to things and you start sneezing in this COVID-19 environment, next thing they start saying you have to. So I don't want that to happen to us. So if you write on a little piece of paper for me, like the Calypso say, I will be so guided, Mr. Speaker. So there's no back and forth. But you are in charge of this chamber. You, the captain. You, the pilot in command. And I will obey, even though I'm a big man at my home. But I'm not going to take instructions from anyone opposite in terms of what I should say and what I should not say. There are no turbulence. There are no turbulence. There are no turbulence. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as I prepare to close, Mr. Speaker, I will insist, Mr. Speaker, like my colleagues, that attention be paid to the vulnerable people in this country. That is where I want to see our money spent, within the fiscal framework and otherwise. Let us create an improved framework for people to be able to survive. It's like we're not in COVID-19, you know, it's just business as usual. So we have no more, we have negative, the last batch tested negative, all our people have actually recovered, and so we are about to open the borders and we're taking off as if nothing happened. COVID-19, the full impact, we have not felt it, Mr. Speaker. And the government, despite what they say about election, clearly, these are election projects. You know, to build up yourself and to do whatever you want. They can do their projects, Mr. Speaker. But we want them to take care of the people. And I leave that question for them to ponder. Of what use is $1 million in a rich man's pocket in the desert where he needs a bottle of water? He wants to buy a bottle of water. And the millions that they think they can spend, of what use is going to be to buy votes in the desert of political discontent in this country? So, Mr. Speaker, I'm advising the government to take care of the people of this country. Currently, fuel prices are artificially high, and this fuel tax is being used as a tax system in itself, placing further burdens on the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, I rest.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm very happy with many of the answers that members on the opposite side had on the technical aspect of the project was, I have to say, very well answered by the member from Castries North. I thought his presentation was clinical, was thorough, and went through the entire process as to how this particular project emerged. So I'm going to try to deal with Mr. Speaker very quickly because I know it's been a long day so far and we still have many more motions and also bills to debate. A member from Castries East, has reiterated his position, Mr. Speaker, that we were not ready for COVID. So I'm not so sure that that question deserves any answer, Mr. Speaker, because the evidence certainly is there to show that, as I've indicated in the past, the Caribbean has done exceptionally well, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I never said in this debate this morning on the record that we are not ready for COVID. The Prime Minister and I had a side, and
Honorable continues.
The Prime Minister and I had an aside, and he said to me, you said you're not ready for COVID. And I responded, I stand by that statement. But I'd like you to check the records. I never said on the records that we were not ready for COVID this morning. I never said so. But again, Mr. Speaker, if you cannot say something on the side to the Prime Minister, it takes the whole problem. And you know, so I never said so this morning.
Speaker, the member from Castres indicated that the government was caught with his pants down. I would say to you that that certainly suggests that he's saying that we weren't ready for COVID. I don't know if there's a different interpretation of that saying, Mr. Speaker, but I stand to be corrected if there is. Mr. Speaker, but as I said, the evidence certainly suggests the answer to that question. Caribbean has done very well, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that St. Lucia has done the best in the Caribbean. And again, I wanted to be on record, Mr. Speaker, my gratitude to the Ministry of Health, headed by the Minister of Health, the CMO and her staff, and in particularly the contact tracing staff, members of the police force, members of the fire brigade, members of customs, members of the ministries that stayed operational during the period, the incredible team that we had put together, headed by the Minister of Tourism, who have daily meetings, Mr. Speaker, daily, every single day, that there is a meeting. I believe it's at 8:30 in the morning, and they have stayed consistent over that. Mr. Speaker, the member from Castres East also indicated that construction is not the only source of employment. I agree with the member. And in terms of trying to turn the economy around, Mr. Speaker, and given the fact that our international borders are currently closed, Mr. Speaker, and also given the fact that the ability to reopen our international borders are not a decision solely by the state. The June 4th date, Mr. Speaker, that we announced was a date in which we said that St. Lucia was in fact ready. And I have indicated repeatedly, I don't believe the rest of the world is ready. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia has made it part of our protocols that persons who are going to come to St. Lucia to vacation, that they first have to have a COVID negative test. We've also indicated that they would be limited in terms of where they would go during a pilot phase of this program. So, Mr. Speaker, the intention was for at least the first month or 6 weeks that we would have had tourists that were coming into the hotels, and that would have given us sufficient time, Mr. Speaker, to determine the evidence as to whether the pre-screening, meaning having persons pre-tested, combined with the other protocols, was sufficient to minimize the risk, Mr. Speaker. And so I'm seeing, Mr. Speaker, that every attempt has been made to have a Caribbean and particular CARICOM position on that. Some countries have decided that they're going to test on arrival, Mr. Speaker, but test nonetheless. St. Lucia still maintains its position that we believe that persons should be tested prior to coming to St. Lucia. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the members on the opposite side have the habit, Mr. Speaker, of coming to the House and saying contradictory things. Several members on the other side indicated that no consultation, that they have seen that this government, despite COVID and the economic impact of COVID, that we have not seemed to have changed course, Mr. Speaker. And we're very concerned that many of the capital projects that we were undertaking that we were still proceeding with them. Those capital projects, Mr. Speaker, that we're undertaking are the ones that have been negotiated over the last couple of years. It wasn't to say that when COVID came about, that all of a sudden we decided, you know what, a good thing to do, it would be the airport project. And in a matter of 3 weeks, that we've been able to negotiate a $250 million US loan between the World Bank, the Taiwanese, and a consortium of banks. I mean, I know that the Minister of Infrastructure and the Ministry of Finance is good, but I can't imagine that they were that good. I cannot imagine, Mr. Speaker, that members on the opposite side believe that after COVID and the impact of COVID, that we woke up one day and decided, hey, let's get some money and let's do a bunch of roads. The road program has been under negotiation, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Infrastructure has indicated, since 2018. We made it very clear, even in our manifesto and our campaign slogan about building a new St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. We came to the House, we passed a gas tax, Mr. Speaker, to do what? To raise monies outside of the budget, to borrow monies in order, Mr. Speaker, to build roads. It's been no secret. And it's because the roads were left in such deplorable condition, Mr. Speaker, that we understood to grow our economy, we had to improve transportation in this country. Mr. Speaker, who has not been on the Grosley to Castries highway in the morning or in the evening and realize how many hours of time is being wasted of persons having to wait in traffic? Who cannot understand, Mr. Speaker, that the farmers and the workers who are traversing up north don't want to go through Castries? Who's not understood this? And so even, Mr. Speaker, their own concept, when we call it the Emma Hippolyte budget, where we're going to spend a significant amount of money in the Grosley constituency, to do what? To strengthen the back roads. And that component was included with the monies that they were going to be using from Kuwait. The only component of that project, Mr. Speaker, that we did not agree with was the idea of creating a 4-lane highway all the way up to Grosley on the existing route, because we believed that it would never be effective. There are too many roads adjoining it, and it would be impossible. And the amount of money, Mr. Speaker, that we would have to spend on land acquisition, we didn't think that that's the way the best money would be spent. So what we said is we would strengthen the back roads, and we would now focus on our attempts to get the north-south highway proceeding, particularly with phase 1, which is from the Darren Sammy Stadium to Dennery, with a major access road on the Alan Bousquet Highway, Mr. Speaker. We have articulated that every single budget, Mr. Speaker. This is not a surprise that all of a sudden, because of COVID, that we've just all of a sudden come up with these ideas. These things were well entrained, Mr. Speaker. St. Jude's started construction long before COVID broke out, Mr. Speaker. Redevelopment of Castries, that goes back to 2008 when the vision plan was put in place. When I indicated that we were going to be demolishing the Princery and the old courthouse, everybody was up in order. There was no consultation, despite the fact, Mr. Speaker, we showed that there was a tremendous amount of consultation back in 2008. We went back through NIP and had several meetings with a whole bunch of interested groups, and it got reiterated that that plan was correct. So, Mr. Speaker, it's ill-informed to suggest that we're not listening. We've also indicated, Mr. Speaker, that when our government came into office and recognizing the significant cash deficit situation and the deplorable economic condition of the country, but even more importantly, Mr. Speaker, the financial disarray the government was in terms of the significant amount of deficits, the lack of spending on critical infrastructural projects over the last couple of years, schools, roads, just to name 2, healthcare, security, that there needed to be an immediate capital injection, and we could not raise that money through the budget. And that's why we introduced 2 new taxes, Mr. Speaker. The airport tax
of which the tourists are the ones paying for it. 85% of the persons who are traveling, Mr. Speaker, into St. Lucia are tourists. That's where the tax was put on, not to the people of St. Lucia. Furthermore, we put on a gas tax of $1.50, and that generates approximately $30 million a year, Mr. Speaker. It had a 5-year moratorium included in it, and it meant that the $30 million was being spent by the Ministry of Infrastructure, potholing and starting major projects. And the remaining amount of money for the next 15 years is now being used to be able to drive one of the largest road infrastructural investments in the history of this country. That investment was further augmented, Mr. Speaker, by what we are here to discuss today, which is the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Road. And as the Minister has articulated, the member from Castries North, grant monies, Mr. Speaker. But where people are being very disingenuous, Mr. Speaker, is that during the COVID outbreak, an outreach was made. The recommendation was made by the members of the opposition. It was also made by the Private Sector Association that there should be an economic recovery committee. And in fact, I believe, I stand to be corrected, that the leader of the opposition reached out to the same private sector and felt that it was important that the opposition be on that. And when they approached me, I said, not a problem, we were going to invite them anyway. And they were invited, Mr. Speaker. They attended 3 meetings on Zoom. They made no contributions. At not one point, Mr. Speaker, in any of the Zoom meetings did the opposition stand up and say and make a comment. But instead, Mr. Speaker, on May 18th, the leader of the opposition wrote a letter to the Permanent Secretary of Finance indicating that he could no longer, and their party could no longer be part of the committee. I'm not so sure he would like me to read it, but if he would like me to, I'm happy to do so. But the fact is that he wrote and withdrew. So I'm confused, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, you want to participate on the economic recovery, but you're indicating that simply because we're proceeding with capital projects that were already designed, that are already funded, and that we've answered the question, Mr. Speaker, that the opportunity to repurpose those funds to be able to provide support for the budgetary support is not possible. The one loan, Mr. Speaker, that we were able to do that with, we did it. We had a $20 million loan with the OECC and the government of Taiwan to build feeder roads, agricultural feeder roads, which we feel is important, but that was the only loan that we had approval on, but we had not worked out the final details of the contract. And we immediately got the permission of President Tsai, and I want to thank the government of Taiwan for responding so quickly to us, to allow us to repurpose the loan to assist in budgetary support, Mr. Speaker. They were one of the first ones who came to the assistance in this dire time. So that was done. During the conversations, Mr. Speaker, you have members on the opposite side that are talking about small businesses and middle-sized businesses. And Mr. Speaker, I was perplexed. I was confused as to where all of a sudden this empathy for small businesses and medium-sized businesses came from, Mr. Speaker. Many members on the opposite side were there when there was a debate on VAT. And members on this side indicated that if you put VAT at 15%, that you were going to kill and crucify all the small businesses. So said, so done, Mr. Speaker, when they put the VAT in at 15%. The same business persons that they're all of a sudden empathetic about, so concerned about, their rent went up by 15%. Costs went up by 15%. And that is what caused the unemployment rate to skyrocket in this country. That's what caused non-performing loans in the banking sector to skyrocket in this country, Mr. Speaker. Simply because members on the other side don't understand business. And as I've said time and time again, members on the opposite side have a philosophy of entitlement. that when the economy is not performing well, when their revenues are not doing well, what do? They increase the taxes because they believe they're entitled, Mr. Speaker, to revenue. Members on this other side don't think that way. When we see that revenues to government are declining, what does it say? There's a structural problem. Let's solve the problem. Let's figure out a way in terms of how we can make sure that the business companies become more competitive in order to be able to stimulate the economy. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, the simple thing of reducing the VAT rate from 15% to 12.5%, a 17% reduction in that rate of tax rate. Immediately, what did we see? Corporate tax went up, personal income taxes went up. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because there was a turnover in the economy and people were being employed. That is an understanding. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Speaker, we have said, and I'm hoping that once I get the report from the Economic Recovery Group, the idea, Mr. Speaker, of providing tax-free incentives, corporate tax-free incentives, to the banking sector to put together special programs specifically targeted to SMMEs. And if they are not going to pay taxes on it, it increases the amount of risk that they can take and therefore can provide some cash injection because our banks are liquid. The banks are not in trouble, Mr. Speaker. What the banks want to do is to make sure that we don't return to the old days of non-performing loans. And our government is cognizant of that fact. And that's why we're doing everything to try to get the economy to recover, Mr. Speaker, as fast as we possibly can. Mr. Speaker, members on the other side like to ascribe words and thoughts to members on this side. And one thing they like to do is to say that we are trying to silence them. They try to say that we're trying to blame everyone. I'm very proud of the fact, Mr. Speaker, not at one time that members on this side lament the fact that we have to deal with COVID. At not one point. What we have gotten down to is the business of dealing with what the reality is, Mr. Speaker. We're not ascribing blame to anyone. We're not crying out to say that the Lord has given us too large of a burden to hold. We know that the Lord has entrusted us to be the government of this time and is giving us what we can handle, and we will not let him down. We will make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we stay focused and always remember that it's about the people on the ground, not about numbers. So I can say, Mr. Speaker, I can say that the member from Castries East clearly seems to be constantly disappointed, Mr. Speaker. The fact is how well we've handled COVID from a health perspective. He also seems to be disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that the economy hasn't collapsed. And Mr. Speaker, he obviously seems to be very distraught at the fact that we've been able to continue paying salaries despite the very difficult financial situations. Mr. Speaker, we've indicated that the member from Dennery North made a big performance about borrowing, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, we have put in new revenue streams that fall outside of the recurrent revenue. What we've attempted to do, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure we can make significant capital investments in this country, in investments that can grow the capacity of the country. So when you're talking about taking the international airport from 400,000 passengers to 1.5 million passengers, that is progress. When we're talking about investing in roads and making it more efficient for persons to be able to bring their agricultural produce to market, and the transportation of workers, and therefore, if people are living further away, the commute now is reduced so they can live further away. These are all the kinds of things, Mr. Speaker, that investments do to make us more competitive and to grow our overall economy. But Mr. Speaker, the ultimate goal has to be about creating a surplus budget. So what we did, Mr. Speaker, is we ring-fenced our recurrent revenue and our recurrent expenditures. Borrowed money on the basis of two new revenue streams, Mr. Speaker. One is the airport tax and the other one is the gas tax. And we're using those monies to finance our capital investments. This is the part the members on the other side don't seem to understand, Mr. Speaker. And that is why we continuously say to everyone that even though we're doing these capital projects, it's not coming at the expense of revenues that would have been used to pay salaries or to replace social programs. And so the monies that we went out to borrow, where the member from Vieux-Fort South, indicated that we've boasted. Boasted, Mr. Speaker? No. We wanted to give the general population of this country that we were not going to rely on bonds this year, Mr. Speaker, given how risky we believe the regional securities market is for its appetite of getting more bonds. And therefore, the budget was funded by borrowings. Borrowings from where, Mr. Speaker? IFIs, international financial institutions, where you're borrowing money for 40 years at 0.5%. These are almost grant funds, Mr. Speaker. CDB, IMF, World Bank, ECCB. We also were able to get the commercial banks to increase the amount of overdraft. So what we've been able to do, Mr. Speaker, is to put in a situation where we had $500 million. What we have realized, Mr. Speaker, and I was shocked at the member from Vieux-Fort South because it seems that he forgot about his participation or his comments during the estimates, in which he recognized himself, Mr. Speaker, that the $925 million that we had estimated for tax revenues in this particular environment, in his estimation, was high. He also indicated that any attempt to borrow monies on the regional securities market he felt would be too risky. And he was right. We're seeing that we think that the tax revenue numbers are going to be closer to $800 million, Mr. Speaker. So that means that there's a revenue shortfall. We're also seeing that in the bonds and treasury bills, Mr. Speaker, that normally turn over every year, that this time 25% of the persons are redeeming their bonds and treasury bills. Redeeming it, Mr. Speaker, meaning that when it matures, that they want their cash. And that is generating additional pressure on us of $175 million, Mr. Speaker. So the total amount of money that's required to fund this year's budget, Mr. Speaker, is $900 million. And so to bring up this idea that somehow we are oppressing, undermining, and being insensitive to our workers, that's not true. Of the entire $900 million that's required, Mr. Speaker, we have asked the unions to work with us to defer $50 million. $50 million, Mr. Speaker, is 5.5% of the total amount that we need, Mr. Speaker. 5.5%. So the suggestions that we have come to the workers first, that we're trying to overburden the workers, that's not true, Mr. Speaker. And again, we are often being accused of being autocratic, Mr. Speaker. At no time have we given an ultimatum to the workers. We continue to be involved in dialogue, Mr. Speaker. Dialogue now that is in the public domain. Because this is the business of the people, not just the business of the government and the unions. It impacts everybody in this country, Mr. Speaker, and everyone should have a say. And I'm very grateful for the response by the unions. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, the problem hasn't gone away. COVID hasn't gone away. The economies are not open, and the economies of the world still remain in great doubt as to when they're going to return back to a normal position, Mr. Speaker. And so therefore, I will be responding to the unions and asking them for a recommendation. We made an offer. If you believe that the offer is too burdensome to the individuals, we accept that. But then offer us something that we believe that can work. In the case of Barbados, Mr. Speaker, member from Castries East was very quick to jump up at the last session of the House to read some press statement to say, oh, the Prime Minister has abandoned that idea. There's nothing further from the truth. In fact, a document came out today describing it as boss. Okay? It's not an option. Mr. Speaker, the press statement says, and follow up today, that the Prime Minister has given the unions until the end of June to come back with a response. And in the proposal, what has she offered, Mr. Speaker? She's offered them a 12.5% deferment for 18 months. Not for a year, for 18 months, Mr. Speaker. And that deferment will be for a bond for 5 years, Mr. Speaker, at a rate of 5%. Not 1 year at 3%, 5 years at 5%. And what is she proposing to use the money for, Mr. Speaker? She's proposing to use the money for capital investment. And the justification for the capital investment, Mr. Speaker, is to stimulate the economy, to generate taxes for the state, so that the state would be in a better position to pay civil servant salaries. Now, it's amazing to me, Mr. Speaker, that other countries can do these same things. The same persons that are criticizing us will be celebrating and indicating how great of an idea that was, how original of an idea that was, without watching the details. But the fact is every single government in this region is facing the same dilemma. I'm not saying, Mr. Speaker, that we have the solutions, but what we will continue to do is to find those solutions. We have not imposed those solutions on anyone. What we've said is that we want to have consultation. And you know, I read my letter, and members on the opposite side, and apostles of members on the opposite side, indicating, oh, the Prime Minister threatened them when he said that we were to look at all our legal options. Why? Should the government on this side look at an option that's illegal? If in fact I cannot get the collaboration of the unions, then I must look at what I can do legally. That's not a threat. That's just saying I must find a solution. So one of those legal options, Mr. Speaker, is to be in dialogue with the credit unions, Mr. Speaker, who came out on their own, indicating that if in fact union workers received bonds, that they were prepared to give a moratorium to those loans that they had, and also were prepared, Mr. Speaker, to convert those bonds into cash. I didn't come up with that. So it's at that point that we decided to look and have discussions. We brought FRA. We brought everybody to the table, Mr. Speaker. Nobody's putting a gun to anybody's head or trying to impose anything on anyone. But guess what? There's an opportunity for those same credit unions to buy government bonds at a higher rate, because we have offered them, if they want to take it for 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, the interest rate goes up, Mr. Speaker. But you know what's sad, Mr. Speaker? Is individuals that should know better. Individuals that should know better, Mr. Speaker, would write articles to try to dissuade persons from doing that. So at one point, the recommendation is not to cause workers to defer their salaries. The government is looking for an alternative way in which there can be a win-win situation, meaning government wins because it's getting the bonds. The unions are winning because they're going to get a return on those bonds, forced savings, as well as the workers now are going to benefit because they get to keep their entire salary in cash. But they also know, those workers know that they were influential on those credit unions to provide assistance to their government at this particular time, and will share, Mr. Speaker, in the success of our country. And that is what patriotism is all about, Mr. Speaker. That's what pride is all about. And this government will continue to work with the greatest amount of respect on all sides to do that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members on the opposite side who continue to talk about all this borrowing, and what it's causing. I think one of the members talked about it very well, Mr. Speaker, that what was supposed to go up went down underneath them, what was supposed to go down went up. In our case, Mr. Speaker, how is it you want to say to persons that we're over-borrowing, but meanwhile, the borrowing that we're doing is making investments which is reducing unemployment? That increased borrowing is causing economic growth to take place, and therefore the private sector and small businesses and everyone is benefiting. And Mr. Speaker, incredibly, while all of this is taking place, the debt to GDP is declining. So how is it that they even want to come across, Mr. Speaker, with this idea there was mismanagement in the economy? The numbers don't add up. The facts don't suggest those things, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to achieve thus far. And despite COVID, Mr. Speaker, members on this side are going to remain very committed to the way forward. Members on the other side, Mr. Speaker, talked about the laptop program and the digital divide. Mr. Speaker, this is total hogwash. Members on the other side know better. 3 years in a row they bought laptops. Each year was from a different source, Mr. Speaker. At no point did the laptops have any software that facilitated the learning of students. In fact, the laptops, all they could do was connect to the internet. Absolutely no integration in the school curriculum system. The e-books, which they have all of a sudden forgotten about, that have been introduced already pre-COVID, Mr. Speaker, are now providing that platform. That young kids will no longer have to carry all these heavy books in their bags. Mothers are not going to have to worry about having to buy new editions of the books for their children, their younger children, when they come up in the years. They're going to have to pay now, Mr. Speaker, $250 EC dollars a year for a license, and that replaces the need for all the books that they had. That the teachers now are going to have an administrative software program that's going to help them understand how much time children are spending on their work. And even when children are not in a Wi-Fi zone area, whatever work that they're doing on the ePad, Mr. Speaker, is preserved the moment that they get into a Wi-Fi back at their home, a friend's home, that is now downloaded and connected to the world. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a much better tool to help now with the education of our children, and it includes the curriculum. Mr. Speaker, I'm not even going to get into this idea of transportation of horses. You have investors coming to this country, making investments into this country, and we want to find fault for that. We want to make all kinds of wild allegations. Mr. Speaker, even when we were here last time, members from Viewfort South indicated that Mr. Teo King, he asked the question again, did Mr. Teo King sell any CIP passports? Does he have an escrow account, and how much money does he have in the escrow account? We have repeatedly given the answer. DSH has not sold any CIP passports. We only recently got approved. And again, members on the other side, particularly the member from Castries South, who actually designed the whole program, Mr. Speaker, understands the difference between a donation and real estate. And maybe I can reverse and ask him a question, Mr. Speaker. When a person is approved under a CIP program for real estate, and somebody purchased that real estate, the $300,000 goes to whom? And who does the $300,000 belong to? The $300,000 goes to the investor. The only role that the government has, and he's here and he's free to put on his little red mic, Mr. Speaker, if he so wishes, to intervene. The only role government has is to agree on the escrow agreement. And what does the escrow agreement do, Mr. Speaker? It tells the escrow agent under what conditions the person whose money is being deposited into the account can draw down on it. We've explained why the escrow account, in our humble opinion, can be held outside of St. Lucia. He knows of the difficulties that we're having, Mr. Speaker, because of compliance. So once the CIP board approves of a bank abroad, the monies can be placed there. But these are not our monies. They were never our monies. All we're going to be making sure, Mr. Speaker, is the place that it's going to go into, that the rule of law applies, and we can ensure that we can hold the escrow account agent responsible to make sure that monies are drawn down in the manner in which we approved. But you see, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, we hear members on the other side ask leading questions. Not because they want to know the answers, Mr. Speaker, because they want to cause doubt in people's minds. This is a practice, sadly, Mr. Speaker, regardless of how many times we say it, it's going to continue. Whether it's in St. Lucia, whether it's in Barbados, whether it's in Trinidad, whether it's the United States of America, that's politics. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, I take responsibility for it, because many persons understand and know what this government is doing and are saying we're not doing a good enough job of getting the information out. And so, Mr. Speaker, you will see a renewed effort by my government to make sure that we publicize and educate people constantly, and that we will make sure that our voices rise louder than they've ever risen before. You know why, Mr. Speaker? Because the truth is on our side. Mr. Speaker, we talked about the impact of roads, and particularly in this particular project. Climate change. One of the critical elements of the DFID fund was that it improve and help with climate change, Mr. Speaker, about building resilience. There is no road in this country, maybe other than going through the Bordelais, that requires more resilience building than the West Coast Road. Its vulnerability to landslides, its vulnerability to undermining of the roads, the amount of water that it takes, the amount of villages that it impacts. And so a critical design element was that. One of the things that I'm very proud of in the design of this program, Mr. Speaker, is the multitude of vendors who are on that road will now be formalized. Mr. Speaker, the same way that we've just built Castries Market and put in proper facilities for the vendors, proper washroom facilities for the vendors, is exactly what's going to be taking place on the roads. They're no longer going to be immediately on the side of the road, but as the Minister of Infrastructure indicated, Mr. Speaker, that they will acquire land alongside the road in which now they can have permanent stalls, and we can put washroom facilities in, and so therefore the tour buses can come off the side of the road and things can be bought in a more meaningful environment, a much more conducive environment. This is a critical element of this project because it reaches to the little man, the persons that are really going to benefit from this road, Mr. Speaker. The immediate jobs of construction. Here we are talking about the loss of jobs. 15,000 people in the hotel sector alone, Mr. Speaker. The multitude of people who had small projects going on. Now we have the ability, Mr. Speaker, thankfully, because of these major capital projects, to stimulate and generate as much labor as we possibly can. And Mr. Speaker, I've said it, but it's worth saying over and over again. The difference is with this government, we believe that people in this country want to earn a real living. They want to know they've put in a hard day's work. They want to know that the money that they're earning, it's theirs, and that it's sufficient to be able to help them pay for their loans and to support their families. That's what this government is all about, Mr. Speaker. Even the members on the other side talked about that the road has gotten so bad that people are going on the Latok Road. You really believe that the Latok Road is going to be able to handle all the added stress of persons avoiding going on the Millennium Highway? How's that going to happen? You see it for yourself. Everybody can go to cul-de-sac, Mr. Speaker, and see how cul-de-sac is growing. Very happy to see, Minister, that you're finally going to have a Kentucky Fried Chicken in your area. And I know that there are several other businesses that are growing in the area. But the fact is that with the new bridge, the new roundabout that we're talking about, that what are we going to be doing? We're going to be uplifting the standard of living of everybody in Valley, including the member from Vieux Fort South who lives in the area. This government is about uplifting the standards of this country, raising people's profiles, getting them to be more ambitious than they've ever been before, Mr. Speaker. That's what this is about. So, Mr. Speaker, I've indicated what we're going to be doing with the small businesses. So in addition to the tax incentives, we're also looking to provide incentives to the small businesses themselves. The EU has now put €5 million into the St. Lucia Development Bank, specifically for SMEs, Mr. Speaker. We're looking to work with the World Bank to repurpose some loans to go into SLTB. The CDB, the same thing. We're also speaking to the NIC to see if we could make monies available. And certainly in the new economic fund, the intention is to make some of the monies coming from CIP going into the economic fund that can be vested into the St. Lucia Development Bank for on-lending, particularly for equity investments in small businesses. Mr. Speaker, we know that, and we believe it genuinely, that small businesses matter. But as I said, this has been a process, Mr. Speaker. The first thing that we had to do was to deal with the health part. You can't start even thinking about growing your economy until we have COVID under control in this country. And Mr. Speaker, we had an incredible team, despite what members on the other side are saying, that we were caught with our pants down. We were not. Mr. Speaker, we were not caught with our pants down when it came to the economic of our government, that we were able to quickly raise those levels of funds in order to take out any form of anxiety in our upcoming budget. But Mr. Speaker, now that we've got that resolved, we're going to be focusing on the small businesses. And I'm looking forward any day now, Mr. Speaker, that the Economic Recovery Council will be presenting a report to us. I'm saddened, Mr. Speaker, genuinely, that the opposition chose to back away from that process, Mr. Speaker, though they were invited to do so. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, that they had the impressions that my government was simply going to hand over the keys of the government to them and that they would get to run government jointly with us. What we want is ideas. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, Minister, as to whether they have those ideas or not. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I want to say thank you very much. I've just received a very distressing note, Mr. Speaker, if I can share it with everyone. We just heard that the untimely passing of the former Minister of Education, Margarita Alexander. So I want to say that we extend our sincerest condolences to her family on this passing. And she was a wonderful woman, and I'm very sorry to hear of her passing. Again, on that note, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I look forward to the support of the members of this House on our bill. Despite their initial trepidation, Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that we've provided sufficient information that we certainly can get their full support on this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, the question is that Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow an amount not exceeding the equivalent of US $7,945,000 from the Caribbean Development Bank's Ordinary Capital Resources (OCR) to finance the Millennium Highway and West Coast Reconstruction Project. And be it further resolved that A, the interest is payable at a rate of 4.8% per annum on the amount of the loan withdrawn and outstanding. B, the commitment charge is payable at a rate of 1% per annum on the amount of the OCR portion unwithdrawn. C, the loan is repayable in 48 equal or approximately equal and consecutive quarterly installments on each first day of January, first day of April, first day of October of each year, commencing on the first due date immediately following the expiration of 5 years after the date of the loan agreement or on a later due date that the Caribbean Development Bank specifies in writing. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg that the House remain suspended for 40 minutes. Huh? 40? 45?
House to stand suspended for the next 40 minutes. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The House is suspended.
Thank you so much for staying with the broadcast. We've come to the evening session of the sitting of Parliament, where members of Parliament have been debating the motion, be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow an amount not exceeding the equivalent of US $7,945,000 from the Caribbean Development Bank's Ordinary Capital Resources (OCR) to finance the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Reconstruction Project. Be it further resolved that the interest is payable at a rate of 4.8% per annum on the amount of the loan withdrawn and outstanding. The commitment charge is payable at a rate of 1% per annum on the amount of the OCR portion and withdrawn. The loan is repayable in 48 equal or approximately equal and consecutive quarterly installments on each first day of January, first day of April, and first day of October each year, commencing on the first due date immediately following the expiration of 5 years after the date of the loan agreement, or on a later due date that the Caribbean Development Bank specifies in writing. Before the break, we heard from Minister for Infrastructure, Ports, Energy and Labour and Parliamentary Representative for Castries North, Honourable Stevenson King, who highlighted a number of areas with regards to the project. He indicated that the government of St. Lucia, in negotiations with the Taiwanese government, insisted that local contractors are engaged to take part in the project. The contractors will bid for this opportunity, an opportunity which will fortify their skills and capabilities, therefore upskilling local contractors in St. Lucia, which will work to the benefit of the Ministry of Infrastructure and by extension the country. Project management skills will also be increased, thus strengthening institutional skills as well. The project encompasses the rehabilitation of the roads, including the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Road, the bridge and road safety technical assistance and institutional support, as well as road furniture such as sidewalks and railways. The total of the project is $99.4 million, and the project will provide employment for a number of St. Lucians throughout the island for the duration of the project. The minister noted especially that DFID and the CDB has urged that women play a part in the national development of the country, and for this particular project, traffic management will be handled by women. The rehabilitation of the cul-de-sac bridge is being funded by the government of Japan, and the bridge will cost some 42 million EC dollars. For this project, the river will be retrained and bones will be created so as to reduce the possibility of overflow, and we know the cul-de-sac area is very prone to flooding, and this bridge will be specially designed so as to prevent that. It will be at a higher elevation and a wider span to ensure no flooding in that area and no flooding on the bridge itself. Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Growth, Job Creation, External Affairs and the Public Service and Parliamentary Representative for Maple South, Honourable Alan Chasney, in his closing arguments addressed a number of areas, including St. Lucia's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He commended all those involved in ensuring that St. Lucia's successful response to the threat. He indicated that while St. Lucia will be reopening its borders on the 4th of June, a number of protocols have been put in place to ensure the safety of St. Lucians. These include that visitors are to present a negative COVID-19 test taken not more than 48 hours before travel, and visitors will have limited access to other parts of the island. He explained that capital projects to come on stream have been in the pipeline for some years now, and that while the funds could not have been redirected, these projects will of course provide employment for the people of St. Lucia. Lastly, the Prime Minister noted that focus will be placed on small businesses so as to provide some sort of relief in the face of COVID-19. The Prime Minister indicated that the government will be putting in place tax incentives as well as incentives specifically for small businesses, and commencing negotiations on repurposing loans to assist small businesses in St. Lucia. Once again, we'll be taking a 40-minute break and we will be back with the broadcast. Please stay with us.